There is a city beneath Sydney, not the tunnels everyone knows about, not the drainage infrastructure, not the rail loops that were planned and abandoned in the middle of the 20th century. Something older than all of that. Something that was discovered and then buried again, very deliberately, at a time when the colonial administration had every reason to make sure nobody asked too many questions about what they had found. This is not a story that starts with a spectacular discovery or ends with a clean answer. It starts with a survey and a silence, with a hole that was opened and a decision made above it that the public would never know it had been there. And it ends with hundreds of thousands of people walking over it every single day, taking their coffee from the same cafes, catching the same trains, living their lives above a question that was sealed before their great-grandparents were born. I want to be clear about something before we go further. This is not a conspiracy theory. The word conspiracy implies a secret operation conducted by shadowy figures with extraordinary power. What actually happened beneath Sydney is far more mundane and, in some ways, far more disturbing than that. It is a story about institutional inertia, about the bureaucratic instinct to close a file rather than open one, about the way that administrative decisions made by tired men in colonial offices can echo for 150 years in ways they never intended and never imagined. The evidence is not hidden. It is scattered across the public record. It is in archived survey reports, in letters held in the Mitchell Library, in geological observations made by men who had no particular agenda and every professional reason to write down exactly what they saw. The problem is not that the evidence was destroyed. The problem is that nobody assembled it into a single picture until recently, and when you do, the picture is deeply uncomfortable. If you're watching this to fall asleep, that's exactly why I make these videos. Maybe subscribe and let me know where are you right now and what time is it. Let us go back to 1848. The colony of New South Wales has been a functioning British settlement for 60 years. Sydney has grown from a collection of tents and timber buildings into a city with ambitions, with sandstone churches and government buildings that were designed to project permanence. The administration is in the process of commissioning a detailed underground survey of the Central District, partly to understand the ground conditions before further major construction begins, and partly because the city had been experiencing a series of puzzling subsidence events. Buildings were settling unevenly in ways that the engineers could not entirely explain by reference to the local geology. The survey team that went underground in August of 1848 was led by a man named William Carver. He was a surveyor of solid professional reputation, not the kind of man to invent what he saw, not the kind of man who would have anything to gain from fabricating an account. His field notes from that survey survive in the Mitchell Library in Sydney. They are, for most of their length, exactly what you would expect from a competent, mid-19th century surveyor documenting geological conditions. He describes the Hawkesbury sandstone that forms the bedrock of most of central Sydney. He notes groundwater seeps and the depth of the clay overburden in various locations. He records the thickness of the fill that the early colonists had used to level the ground around the original settlement. And then, on page 43 of his field notes, the tone of the document changes. It changes so abruptly that you notice it immediately, even if you are not looking for anything unusual. The handwriting, which has been steady and businesslike throughout the preceding pages, becomes slightly larger. The spacing between words opens up slightly. These are the physical signs of a man who is writing carefully, choosing every word, aware that what he is recording is not ordinary. What Carver describes is a passage, not a natural cave, not a geological void, not anything that could reasonably be explained by the ordinary processes of the sandstone geology he had been documenting for the preceding weeks. He describes a passage that has been cut. He uses that word specifically, cut. He describes the walls as being smooth in a way that the surrounding sandstone was not. The ceiling as having a consistent height over a distance that he paced as being approximately 40 feet before the passage curved, and he did not follow it further. He describes the floor as being flat in a way that natural sandstone floors in the region were not. And he describes the angle of the walls as being precisely vertical in a way that he found, in his own words, difficult to reconcile with any natural process he was aware of. He also describes something on the walls. He is cautious about this in his notes, more cautious than he is about the physical dimensions of the passage. He writes that there were marks on the walls that appeared to have been made intentionally, but that he could not interpret. He does not call them writing, he does not call them carvings. He calls them marks, and he notes their presence and moves on, as if he was aware that speculating about their nature was beyond his professional remit. The report that was eventually submitted to the colonial administration was not Carver's field notes. It was a formal summary, and that summary does not mention the passage. It does not mention the marks. It addresses the geological conditions of the survey area in terms that are consistent with the preceding pages of Carver's field notes and entirely inconsistent with page 43 onward. The 43-page point is where the official record and the private record diverge, and they never converge again. This divergence is the central fact of what happened beneath Sydney in 1848, and it is worth sitting with for a moment before moving on. William Carver found something. He wrote it down in his private field notes because he was a professional, and that is what professionals did. The formal report does not mention it. This is not by itself proof of a cover-up. There are reasonable explanations. He may have decided on reflection that he had misinterpreted what he saw. The passage may have been explained to him by a superior as something known and unremarkable. The formal report may have been written by someone else working from a different set of notes. Any of these explanations is possible, but none of them explains what happened next. What happened next is that William Carver left the Colonial Survey Service within 3 months of submitting that report. He had been employed by the government for 11 years. He left without explanation, at least without any explanation that appears in the surviving records. He established a private practice in Parramatta. He continued working as a surveyor for another 30 years. And in all of that time, in all of the letters and professional correspondence that have survived, he never mentioned the survey of 1848 again. Not once. Not in private letters to colleagues, not in professional papers, not in anything. That silence is interesting. It is not conclusive. People do not always write down everything they know, but it is interesting because William Carver was, by every other account, a man who communicated extensively in writing. His professional correspondence from the Parramatta period is substantial. He wrote about everything. He wrote about disputed property boundaries and the quality of different survey instruments and the deficiencies of his junior colleagues. He was a man with opinions who committed those opinions to paper, and he never mentioned 1848. The passage was rediscovered in 1912, or, more accurately, a passage was discovered in 1912, and there is a reasonable case to be made that it was the same passage. The discovery was made during the construction of a stormwater drain. The workers who broke through into it described it in terms that are remarkably consistent with Carver's description from 64 years earlier. Smooth walls, consistent ceiling height, flat floor, vertical angles. The 1912 accounts are less precise than Carver's, because the men who made them were construction workers rather than surveyors, but the correspondence between the two sets of descriptions is notable. The foreman on the job in 1912 was a man named Patrick Bourke. He is not a famous figure in Sydney's history. He is not a famous figure in anyone's history. He was a foreman on a stormwater construction project, doing his job, and what he found was not something he had been looking for or expecting. His account of the discovery, given in an interview with the Sydney Morning Herald on the 14th of June 1912, describes his first response as confusion. He had broken through what he expected to be solid sandstone and found instead what he described as a made space. That is how he put it. A made space. Not a cave, a made space. The newspaper report is brief. It occupies about 4 column inches on page 8, which is not the position you give to a story you think is significant. The reporter describes the discovery in slightly condescending terms, suggesting that the workers had found an old convict-era construction of some kind. This framing, convict-era construction, was applied to a great many inconvenient discoveries in early 20th century Sydney. It was a catch-all explanation that made things go away. because once you had labeled something as convict-era construction, there was no particular reason to investigate further. The convicts built a lot of things. Everyone knew that. Case closed. The problem with the convict-era construction explanation, in this case and in a number of other cases we will come to, is that it does not survive examination. The earliest convict construction in Sydney dates to the 1790s. William Carver's survey in 1848 was 60 years after that. By 1848, the site of the passage would have been within the settled area of the colony for decades. If there had been convict construction in the area, it would have been known. It would have appeared in the colonial records. The colonial administration kept extremely detailed records of construction projects, because construction required the allocation of convict labor, which required authorization, which required paperwork. There is no paperwork for any convict construction project in the area where the passage was found. None. This does not mean the passage was not made by convicts. It is possible, in theory, for convict labor to have been used without a paper trail. Illegal arrangements existed in the early colonial period, but it strains credibility considerably, and it does not explain William Carver's description of marks on the walls, which he noted as being difficult to interpret. Carver was a man who had seen a great deal of colonial-era construction in his professional life. If the marks on the walls of that passage had been anything he recognized as characteristic of convict workmanship or colonial period tools, he would not have described them as marks he could not interpret. So what was the passage? Who made it? When? And why, specifically, did the colonial administration decide not to include it in the formal record? To approach those questions properly, we have to understand the geology of Sydney in more detail, because the geology is both the context for what was found and part of the reason it matters. Sydney sits on a geological foundation that is, in broad terms, remarkably stable and well understood. The Hawkesbury sandstone that underlies most of the central city is a sedimentary rock laid down approximately 230 million years ago. It is, by geological standards, young sandstone, relatively uniform in its composition and relatively predictable in its behavior. Engineers love it. It is the reason Sydney was able to build tall structures on relatively shallow foundations long before other cities of similar size. The sandstone is strong. It does not compress significantly under load, and it does not contain the underground voids that are the nightmare of civil engineers in limestone country, which is exactly why the discovery of a passage in it was so surprising. Passages in sandstone, natural passages, do occur, but they are rare and they are characteristically irregular. They are formed by water moving through the rock over geological timescales, and the result is always organic, always following the line of least resistance through the stone, always curving and varying in its dimensions as the rock's natural weaknesses dictate. What Carver described, and what Burke confirmed 64 years later, was not that. It was straight. It was regular. It had flat walls and a flat floor and a consistent ceiling height. Those are not the characteristics of a water-formed void in sandstone. Those are the characteristics of something that was engineered. The question of who engineered it is where the story opens into much older and more contested territory. The standard historical account of Sydney begins in 1788 with the arrival of the First Fleet. Before that, in the standard account, the area around what is now central Sydney was occupied by the Gadigal people, one of the groups of the broader Eora Nation, who lived along the southern shore of Port Jackson. The Gadigal did not build in stone. Their traditional architecture was organic, using bark and wood and brush. They did not construct underground passages. In the standard account, there is no category of pre-colonial construction in the Sydney Basin that could explain what Carver found. But the standard account has a gap in it that has been discussed, quietly and largely out of public view, for a very long time. The gap is this. The Gadigal were not the only people who had been in the Sydney Basin. They were the people who were there in 1788. But the archaeological evidence from the region, as it has accumulated over the past several decades, tells a story of human occupation in the Sydney Basin that goes back at least 65,000 years. 65,000 years is a very long time. A great many things can change in 65,000 years, A great many peoples can come and go. A great many building traditions can rise and be forgotten. This is not, to be absolutely clear, a claim that the passage beneath Sydney was built by the ancestors of the Gadigal people. The Gadigal people's own traditions do not include any account of stone construction underground. But the assumption that the people living in the Sydney Basin in 1788 represent the totality of all the peoples who had ever been there, and thus that their building traditions represent the totality of all the building traditions that had ever existed in the region, is not an assumption that the archaeological record supports. People moved. Civilizations rose and fell. Technologies were developed and lost. This is true everywhere in the world, and there is no reason to think the Sydney Basin was an exception. The oldest known evidence of human occupation in the Sydney region comes from a site in the Blue Mountains, roughly 60 kilometers west of the central city. The site, which is not publicly accessible and whose precise location has been deliberately withheld to protect it, contains stone tools and ochre deposits that have been dated to approximately 65,000 years before the present. This makes the Sydney Basin one of the earliest documented sites of human occupation in Australia, and by extension one of the earliest documented sites of human occupation anywhere on Earth. 65,000 years of continuous human presence in a single geographical region represents an extraordinary depth of human experience and cultural development. The question that archaeologists have increasingly been asking, and that has been producing increasingly uncomfortable answers, is what happened during those 65,000 years. Not in the broad strokes, which are reasonably well understood, but in the details. What technologies were developed and then lost? What structures were built and then left to be reclaimed by the landscape? What knowledge accumulated and was then interrupted by the catastrophic disruption of the colonial period? These questions are uncomfortable for the colonial administration's narrative precisely because they open the possibility that the landscape of the Sydney Basin, when the first fleet arrived, was not virgin territory or something close to it, but was instead a palimpsest, a surface written on many times, with older texts still legible beneath the newer ones if you knew how to read them. The passage beneath the central city is one of those older texts, or it may be. The evidence is not conclusive, but the evidence is there. There is a third account of the passage, one that is less widely known than either Carver's notes or Burke's newspaper interview, and in some ways more important than either. It comes from 1937, when a water main extension in the Circular Quay area required excavation that went deeper than the usual urban infrastructure work. The engineer on the project, a man named Harold Osgood, submitted a standard project report to the Sydney Water Board that is entirely routine for most of its length. But in an appendix to that report, filed under the bureaucratically neutral heading of anomalous geological features, Osgood describes finding, at a depth of approximately 8 meters below street level, a section of worked stone that did not correspond to any documented construction in the area. The term worked stone is the key phrase here. Osgood uses it very precisely. He had the geological and engineering expertise to distinguish between sandstone that had been shaped by water, sandstone that had been shaped by colonial-era tools, and sandstone that had been shaped by something else. He describes the worked stone section as having cuts that were characteristically different from anything produced by the iron tools of the colonial period, and as having a surface treatment, a kind of smoothing, that he could not account for in terms of any tool or technique he was familiar with. He also notes in the same appendix that the worked stone appears to be part of a larger structure that extends beyond the limits of the excavation, and that the orientation of the structure, based on the angles of the section visible in the excavation, suggests that it runs roughly northeast to southwest beneath the streets of the Circular Quay area. This is important for two reasons. First, the northeast to southwest orientation corresponds closely to the direction that William Carver's passage, as he described it, appeared to be running when it curved away from him at the 40-foot mark. Second, Circular Quay is not where Carver was working in 1848 or where Burke's workers broke through in 1912. It is nearby, but it is distinct. If the three discoveries are part of the same structure, That structure is considerably larger than any single discovery suggests. Osgood's appendix was submitted with the project report. The project report was filed, and that is where it stayed for 60 years, until a researcher named Helen Forsyth began systematically going through the Sydney Water Board's historical archives in the late 1990s as part of a broader project on the history of Sydney's underground infrastructure. Forsyth was not looking for evidence of pre-colonial construction. She was interested in the history of the water supply system and its relationship to the development of the city. She found Osgood's appendix almost by accident while looking for something else entirely, and her initial reaction, as she later described it, was skepticism. She assumed it was a misinterpretation, that Osgood had found something he had not recognized correctly. She set it aside and moved on. She came back to it several months later, after she had found Carver's field notes in the Mitchell Library. The correspondence between the two descriptions, made by two people with no knowledge of each other's work, separated by nearly a century, was what changed her mind. Not a certainty, but a question that demanded a serious answer. Forsyth's work was published in two academic papers, one in 1999 and one in 2003. Both appeared in journals of archaeology and historical studies. Neither received significant public attention. Academic papers rarely do. But in the small world of researchers working on the pre-colonial history of the Sydney Basin, they were a significant contribution, and they opened a set of debates that are still ongoing. The debate is not about whether something is down there. The debate is about what it is, how old it is, and what it means. And those three questions pull in different directions. On the question of what it is, the range of proposed explanations is wide. At one end of the spectrum, there are researchers who maintain that the most parsimonious explanation is still the most likely one, that what has been found are the remnants of colonial-era construction that has not been adequately documented, and that the apparent anomalies in the descriptions of the walls and the tools used to work the stone reflect the limitations of 19th and early 20th century engineering knowledge rather than any genuinely anomalous origin. This position is defensible. The documentary record of colonial construction in Sydney is extensive but not complete. There were projects that were undertaken and then abandoned, projects whose records were lost in fires or floods or simply through administrative neglect. The absence of a record is not proof of the absence of the construction. At the other end of the spectrum, there are researchers who are willing to entertain the possibility that what has been found is evidence of a pre-colonial construction tradition that we do not yet have a framework for understanding. This position is more speculative, but not without support. The Australian archaeological record has been producing evidence over the past several decades that increasingly challenges the assumption that Indigenous Australians did not engage in any form of complex construction or engineering. The sophisticated stone aquaculture systems found in Victoria, the extensive earth modification visible from the air at various sites across the continent, the evidence of complex land management practices that have been dated back tens of thousands of years, all of these complicate the picture considerably. The middle ground, which is where most serious researchers position themselves, is that there is something beneath central Sydney that warrants proper archaeological investigation, that the investigation has not been conducted because the process of doing so would be expensive, disruptive, and politically complicated, and that the institutional inertia of the various government bodies that would need to agree on an investigation has so far prevented anything serious from happening. This middle ground position is, in its own way, the most disturbing of the three, because it means that what is down there is not a conspiracy. It is not a cover-up in the dramatic sense of that word. It is something more banal and more pervasive, a collective disinclination to look too hard at something that might require difficult answers. It is the bureaucratic version of a polite decision not to ask a question that you suspect you might not want to hear the answer to. We have to talk about the Gadigal now, because they are part of this story in ways that the conventional account of the sealed city tends to underplay. The Gadigal people were the traditional custodians of the southern shore of Port Jackson, which is the area that became central Sydney. By 1848, when William Carver was conducting his survey, The Gadigal people had been subjected to 60 years of colonial dispossession, disease, and deliberate policy. Their numbers had been catastrophically reduced. Their land had been taken. Their social structures had been disrupted beyond recognition. Their knowledge, the accumulated cultural knowledge of 65,000 years of continuous human presence in the region, was fragmenting under the pressure of colonial contact. This is relevant to the question of what lies beneath Sydney, because that knowledge, the knowledge held by the Gadigal and by the other peoples of the Eora Nation, was the one body of information that might have contained an account of what had been built, by whom, when, not necessarily because the Gadigal themselves had built it, but because 65,000 years of continuous occupation of a landscape creates an extraordinary depth of knowledge about that landscape. Things that had been built and abandoned long before living memory might still have been encoded in stories, in the names of places, in the accumulated knowledge of elders who knew what was beneath the ground because it was their ground. The colonial administration of New South Wales had no interest in that knowledge. This was not unique to New South Wales. It was characteristic of British colonial practice everywhere. The indigenous knowledge of a place was systematically disregarded, not always out of malice, sometimes simply out of the profound incuriosity that comes with the assumption that the people who had been in a place before you arrived had nothing of value to teach you. The sandstone churches and government buildings of early Sydney were built by people who knew a great deal about the surface of the country and very little about its depths, and who had, at hand, people who might have been able to tell them something about those depths, but who were never asked. What the Gadigal oral tradition does contain, what has survived in the fragments that were recorded by sympathetic observers in the 19th century and by later ethnographers, is a set of accounts of the land beneath the harbour that are anomalous in ways that conventional accounts of Aboriginal mythology in the region tend not to dwell on. Several of these accounts refer to passages, to underground spaces, to places where the land was hollow. They are described in terms that are consistent with the spiritual geography of the Gadigal world, in terms that connect the underground spaces with particular beings and particular kinds of significance. They are not, in any straightforward sense, engineering reports. They are not accounts of construction, but they are accounts of something being there, something old and significant and not entirely natural. And they were recorded by people with no knowledge of William Carver's field notes or Harold Osgood's appendix. The passage of this kind of knowledge through oral tradition across very long periods of time is not, as it was once fashionable to assume, a process that necessarily distorts or destroys the original information. There is now a substantial body of research demonstrating that certain kinds of knowledge can be preserved with remarkable accuracy in oral tradition over timescales that would seem impossible to anyone raised in a culture that relies on writing. The astronomical knowledge encoded in some Aboriginal traditions has been demonstrated to refer to events that occurred tens of thousands of years ago. The geographical knowledge encoded in other traditions has been demonstrated to accurately reflect coastlines that have not existed since sea levels rose at the end of the last ice age. If that kind of accuracy is possible in oral tradition, then the possibility that a tradition referring to underground passages in the Sydney Basin might reflect an actual physical reality rather than pure mythology cannot be dismissed. None of this is proof. None of it is even close to proof. But it is a convergence of physical evidence, of independent observations separated by decades, of documentary records that diverge in ways that suggest a deliberate decision was made, of indigenous oral tradition that refers to the same general area in terms that are at least consistent with the physical evidence. Convergences of this kind do not prove anything, but they are what investigations are made of. They are the thing that should prompt a serious inquiry to determine whether the evidence stands up under proper scrutiny. That serious inquiry has not happened, and the reasons it has not happened are themselves part of the story. Let us follow the physical evidence forward from 1937. Osgood's report was filed and largely forgotten. The water main was constructed. The worked stone section that Osgood described was covered over again by the new infrastructure. The excavation was backfilled. The street above was repaved. Life went on. The next significant discovery in the sequence was made in 1954, during work on the underground railway extension that eventually became part of the City Circle line. This discovery was made at a considerably greater depth than any of the previous ones, at a depth that would place it, in terms of the geology, below the level of the Hawkesbury sandstone cap and into the transition zone between the sandstone and the older geological formation beneath. At this depth, the characteristics of the surrounding rock change and natural voids become more common. The engineers working on the extension had a well-developed protocol for dealing with unexpected voids, which is to say they knew what to do when they found them. Document, assess for structural significance, backfill, if safe to proceed, continue. What the engineer in charge of the relevant section, a man named Douglas Merton, found was not a natural void. He found what he described in his project notes as a chamber. The notes are technical and precise, as you would expect from a mid-20th century civil engineer with his professional reputation on the line in a major public works project. He describes the dimensions: approximately 12 meters in length, approximately 6 meters in width, approximately 3 meters from floor to ceiling. He describes the floor as being level, the walls as being vertical, the ceiling as being roughly flat with some irregularities. He describes what appear to be niches in 2 of the walls, regular intervals, each approximately half a meter square. He also describes something on the floor of the chamber. At the center of the chamber, he writes, "There is a circular depression in the rock, approximately 2 meters in diameter, and perhaps 30 centimeters at its deepest point. The depression has been worked. Its edges are regular. Its surface is smooth. It is, in his assessment, not a natural feature of the rock." This description is interesting not because it proves anything, but because of how precisely it does not correspond to any category of colonial-era construction. The colonial administration of New South Wales built extensively underground. It built cisterns, sewers, drainage channels, cellars, storage chambers, tunnels for convict labor. All of these were documented in considerable detail because documentation was the administrative mechanism by which convict labor was controlled and accounted for. The chamber Merton describes does not resemble any of these. The niches in the walls, the circular depression in the floor, these are not features of utility construction. They are features of a different kind of space. Merton's notes were submitted with the standard project documentation. A brief note in the covering letter indicates that the chamber was assessed as not presenting a structural risk to the tunnel work, that it was backfilled to allow work to continue, and that the discovery was referred to the Department of Lands for any further action that department might consider appropriate. There is no record of the Department of Lands taking any further action. The backfill went in, the tunnel went through, the trains began running, and the chamber, with its level floor and its niches and its worked circular depression, was sealed again beneath meters of concrete and compressed aggregate. There is one more element to the physical evidence that we need to address before we begin to consider what the evidence, taken as a whole, might mean. It concerns a series of ground-penetrating radar surveys that were conducted in the early 2000s as part of routine infrastructure assessment work in the Central Business District. Ground-penetrating radar is a technology that was not available to any of the earlier investigators we have discussed. It allows engineers and geologists to see into the ground without breaking it open, using radar pulses to detect anomalies in the subsurface that might indicate voids, different densities of material, or changes in the structure of the rock. The surveys were conducted for entirely routine purposes, to assess the condition of existing underground infrastructure before further construction work was undertaken. They were not conducted by archaeologists. They were not looking for evidence of pre-colonial construction. They were looking for leaky pipes and deteriorating tunnels, and the kind of geological hazards that make civil engineers nervous before they start digging. What several of these surveys detected, at depths corresponding to the levels at which the previous discoveries had been made, were anomalies that did not correspond to any known infrastructure element. The anomalies were described in the survey reports as areas of apparent void space or low-density material that do not correspond to documented subsurface infrastructure. The reports note the anomalies, flag them for further investigation if work in the area proceeds, and move on. They are not in any sense sensational documents. They are routine engineering reports that happen to contain, embedded in technical language, a confirmation that there is something below the streets of central Sydney that the engineers cannot account for. The surveys were filed. Some of them were made available under Freedom of Information requests over the following years. Helen Forsyth obtained copies of the relevant sections and incorporated their findings into the body of evidence she had been accumulating. The anomalies detected by the radar surveys correspond, in their general location, to the areas where the physical discoveries were made in 1848, 1912, 1937, and 1954. Not with precision, because radar surveys of this kind are not precision instruments, but in a way that is consistent with the hypothesis that the different discoveries are parts of a single larger structure. That is where the physical evidence stands. And now we have to ask the harder question, which is not what is down there, but what the existence of it means, and why the meaning has been so consistently avoided. The avoidance has not been, for the most part, active. It has not been the result of people deciding to conceal evidence and issuing instructions to that effect. There may have been an element of that in 1848, when the formal report diverged from Carver's field notes, but even that is not certain. What has characterized the handling of the discoveries beneath Sydney from the 1840s to the 2000s is not so much concealment as categorization. Everything found has been categorized in a way that makes further inquiry unnecessary. Colonial-era construction. Anomalous geological feature. Not presenting a structural risk. Each of these categorizations is, in its context, technically defensible, and each of them functions to close the file. The closing of the file is what matters, because what lies beneath Sydney, if it is what the evidence suggests it might be, is not simply an archaeological curiosity. It is a fundamental challenge to the historical narrative that has been foundational to the legitimacy of colonial settlement in Australia. The legal and moral basis of the colonial project in New South Wales rested, among other things, on the doctrine of terra nullius, the legal fiction that Australia was, at the time of European arrival, an unoccupied land, or a land so lightly occupied that it could be treated as unowned. This doctrine has been formally repudiated in Australian law since the 1992 Mabo decision, but it has shaped the colonial and post-colonial history of the country in ways that are still working themselves out. If there is evidence beneath Sydney of a constructed environment, of passages and chambers and worked stone, evidence that predates European settlement by a margin that might be measured in centuries or millennia, then the implications are significant. Not because it proves any particular historical narrative, not because it answers definitively who built it or when, but because it means that the land beneath the streets of Australia's oldest European city is not the blank slate that the colonial project assumed it to be. It means that there was, before 1788, a human relationship with this landscape that included not just living on the surface, but modifying what lay beneath. And that changes the story. It changes it in ways that are not comfortable for anyone who has a stake in the current distribution of history, meaning, and legitimacy. This includes, to be direct about it, the Australian government at various levels, which has reasons not to open an archaeological investigation that might produce results requiring inconvenient answers. It includes the various infrastructure bodies whose assets sit above the relevant areas and who do not want their pipes and tunnels and train lines disturbed by a research project of uncertain outcome. It includes the heritage industry, which has its own frameworks for assessing what counts as heritage and who gets to define it. And it includes, paradoxically, some elements of the Indigenous rights movement, which has reasons to be cautious about narratives of pre-colonial complexity that they did not originate and that they cannot control. The result is an impasse, not a secret, not a conspiracy. An impasse produced by the collision of institutional interests, with a question that nobody in a position to act on it has found sufficient reason to take the political and professional risk of pursuing. And beneath the streets of Sydney, in the Hawkesbury sandstone, at depths between 4 and 15 meters, in passages and chambers that were there before anyone now living was born, the question remains unanswered. We have established that something is down there. We have established that the something has been found multiple times by multiple independent observers, that the descriptions across more than a century and a half correspond in ways that are difficult to dismiss, and that the institutional response to each discovery has been to file and forget. Now we have to try to understand what the something might be, and to do that we have to go further back, much further back. 65,000 years is an almost incomprehensible span of time. For context, modern civilization, in the sense of complex urban societies with writing and specialized labor and centralized administration, is approximately 5,000 years old in its oldest instances, and considerably younger in most of the world. 65,000 years is 13 times the entire span of civilized history. To think about what might have happened in the Sydney Basin during 65,000 years of continuous human occupation is to confront the limits of historical imagination. We know from the Australian archaeological record that the first humans in Australia were not less capable than the humans who were developing early civilizations in the Fertile Crescent and the Indus Valley. They were anatomically and cognitively identical to any other modern humans. They were capable of the same range of cultural and technological development. The question of why they developed in the particular direction they did, rather than in the direction of urban civilization as defined by the Eurocentric model, is a complicated question that does not have a simple answer. And it is not the question we are trying to answer here. What we are trying to understand is the trajectory of technological and cultural development in the Sydney Basin over a period of tens of thousands of years, and whether any part of that trajectory might have included the kind of construction represented by the passages and chambers that have been found beneath the central city. The evidence for complex construction traditions in pre-colonial Australia has been growing steadily and being received with growing interest by researchers who are not committed to the older, simpler narrative. The most famous examples are the aquaculture systems of Victoria and the western districts of New South Wales, where Aboriginal peoples constructed elaborate systems of channels, weirs, and traps in stone, systems that were designed to manage the movement of fish and eels across large areas of the landscape. These systems are of considerable age in some cases, with dates suggesting construction activity going back several thousand years, and they represent a level of engineering complexity that was entirely invisible to the colonial settlers who destroyed many of them without understanding what they were. Less well known are the evidence of complex earthworks at various sites across the continent, some of which have been detected only through aerial photography and satellite imaging because they are too large to be understood from ground level. These earthworks are not the dramatic pyramids or monuments of other ancient cultures. They are modifications of the landscape, shaped mounds, directed drainage systems, cleared areas, all evidence of a relationship with the land that involved active engineering rather than passive occupation. None of these examples, to be absolutely clear, are evidence of underground construction in the style of what has been found beneath Sydney. They are evidence of engineering capability, of a tradition of modifying the physical environment in sophisticated ways, of a depth of technological knowledge and cultural continuity that the colonial narrative systematically denied. They are the context within which the passages and chambers beneath Sydney have to be understood. The context is not proof, but it is the appropriate intellectual frame for thinking about the question, and it is a frame that has been missing from most of the public discussion about what lies beneath the city. There is one more body of evidence to consider before we attempt any synthesis. It is the most speculative of the bodies of evidence we have discussed, and it requires the most careful handling, but it is also in some ways the most compelling because of where it comes from and how it arrived. In the late 1980s, a historian named Judith Crawford began interviewing Gadigal community members and descendants as part of a project on the oral history of the Sydney region. Crawford was not an archaeologist. She was a social historian, interested in the lived experience of Aboriginal people in the colonial and post-colonial period. Her interviews were not structured around questions about underground structures or pre-colonial construction. They were structured around questions about family history, about the experience of colonial contact, about the places that had been significant and the places that had been lost. In the course of those interviews, over a period of several years, Crawford encountered a set of accounts that she found difficult to categorize. Several of her interviewees, independently and without apparent knowledge of each other's accounts, made reference to places underground, to passages and chambers that were described as being very old, older than the settlement, older than anything that the community's living memory extended to. The descriptions were embedded in broader accounts of spiritual geography, of the significance of particular places, of the reasons why certain areas of the land had been treated with particular reverence. Crawford was aware that she was not in a position to assess the physical reality behind these accounts. She was not a geologist or an engineer. She noted the accounts in her project materials, reflected on their consistency with each other, and did not, in her published work, make any direct claims about their physical basis. She was sufficiently careful as a historian to know that the same words can describe both a physical reality and a metaphorical or spiritual one, and that distinguishing between the two is not always possible, especially across the cultural distance that separates a non-Indigenous historian from the traditions she is documenting. But she did something that turned out to be significant. She noted the location references in the accounts, the references to where the underground places were, to which streets and landmarks in the modern city corresponded to places that had been significant in the oral tradition. And when those location references are plotted on a map of central Sydney, they correspond with a correspondence that is not perfect, but is not random, to the areas where the physical discoveries have been made. This is not proof, to repeat, this is not proof. But it is the third independent line of evidence, in addition to the 19th and 20th century engineering records and the ground-penetrating radar surveys, that points toward the same area of the city's subsurface. 3 independent lines of evidence, from 3 completely different sources, using 3 completely different methods, arriving at the same general conclusion. In any other field of inquiry, this would be considered sufficient reason to conduct a proper investigation. The investigation has not been conducted, the reasons we have already discussed. But the absence of the investigation does not make the evidence disappear. It does not make William Carver's field notes unreal, or Patrick Burke's newspaper interview fictional, or Douglas Merton's project notes fabricated, or Harold Osgood's appendix apocryphal, or the ground-penetrating radar anomalies, a data processing error. Those things exist. They are in the public record. Anyone can find them. What they cannot do yet is add up to a definitive answer about what is down there. That answer requires an investigation that has been forestalled by a combination of institutional reluctance, political complexity, and the simple human disinclination to ask hard questions when the process of asking them is likely to be expensive and inconvenient. Sydney is not unique in this. The history of underground discoveries that have been made and then quietly closed is not particular to Australia or to the colonial period. There is something about underground spaces, about things that lie beneath the ordinary surface of the known world, that has always provoked the same combination of fascination and anxiety. The fascination is obvious. The anxiety is about what the discovery would mean if it turned out to be real. In Sydney's case, what the discovery would mean, if the evidence holds up under investigation, is that the ground beneath Australia's oldest European city was shaped by human hands long before those hands were European. It would mean that the terra nullius narrative, already legally repudiated but still culturally powerful, is wrong not just in principle, but in the most concrete and literal sense possible. It would mean that there is history written in the stone beneath the streets that has no place in the official account of the city above them. This is why the file has been closed each time it was opened, not out of malice mostly, not out of conspiracy, in the dramatic sense. Out of the ordinary human preference for a world that fits neatly into the frameworks we already have, over a world that requires those frameworks to be rethought from the ground up. But the stone remembers. That is the thing about underground spaces. They are not subject to the same forces of erosion and alteration that reshape the surface. What is down there has been down there for a very long time, sealed under backfill and concrete and the weight of a city that grew up above it without knowing it was there. And it will be there when the trains stop running and the buildings come down and the city itself becomes, eventually, as all cities eventually do, a layer in the ground for the next generation of investigators to find. The question is whether we decide to look now, while the evidence is still relatively accessible and while there are still people alive who hold fragments of the knowledge that might help interpret what is found, or whether we wait, as we have been waiting for 170 years, for the decision to close the file to become permanent by default. Let us now consider the geography of the discoveries more carefully, because geography is one of the things that distinguishes a coherent structure from a random collection of anomalies. If what has been found beneath central Sydney is a series of unrelated geological accidents or isolated pieces of colonial-era construction, then their locations should be random, or at least patterned only by the distribution of colonial-era construction work. But if they are parts of a larger structure, they should have a spatial logic, and that spatial logic should be interpretable. The location references in the historical record are not precise enough to produce a definitive map. Carver's field notes give a general area and a direction of travel for the passage he found. Burke's 1912 account gives a street location that can be identified with reasonable confidence. Osgood's 1937 report gives a project zone that can be narrowed down from the infrastructure records. Merton's 1954 notes give a chainage reference on the tunnel alignment that places the chamber within approximately 20 meters of a fixed point. When these references are plotted on a modern map of central Sydney, a pattern begins to emerge. The four locations are not randomly distributed across the city centre. They describe a rough arc, running from the area near Circular Quay in the northeast, through the area that is now the northern end of the central business district, to a point further south and west that corresponds to the location of Merton's chamber. The arc has a rough diameter of perhaps 800 meters, and its center, if you extend the geometry, would fall somewhere in the vicinity of the block bounded by four of the major streets of the central city. This is, deliberately, not being made more specific than that. The process of investigation, if it ever happens, should be led by archaeologists working with indigenous communities and with the relevant government bodies. The location references given here are sufficient to establish that the distribution of the discoveries is not random, without being specific enough to serve as a guide for unauthorized excavation, which would be both illegal and likely to destroy the very evidence that makes the question interesting. What the arc suggests, if it is interpreted as evidence of a structure rather than coincidence, is a building tradition that used curved layouts. This is not unusual in ancient construction. Circular or curvilinear layouts appear in ancient structures from many different cultures and periods, often in contexts that suggest ceremonial or astronomically significant use. The great stone circles of northern Europe, the circular plazas of the ancestral Puebloans, the circular enclosures of the Nabatean culture in the Middle East. There is a recurring human instinct to arrange significant spaces in circular or curvilinear forms that appears across cultures that had no contact with each other. This does not mean that the structure beneath Sydney was built by anyone connected with any of those traditions. Convergent architecture, like convergent evolution in biology, produces similar forms independently in response to similar requirements and preferences. What it does suggest is that the curvilinear layout of the discoveries, if that is what the pattern represents, is not implausible as evidence of intentional design. The northeast to southwest orientation of the passage that Carver described, and the orientation of the work stone that Osgood described, also carry potential significance. The northeast to southwest axis is astronomically significant in the Sydney latitude, in ways that a culture with sophisticated knowledge of the sky would be aware of. The winter solstice sunrise and summer solstice sunset describe a northeast to southwest axis at the latitude of Sydney. If the structure was oriented to astronomical events, which is a reasonable hypothesis for a culture with a documented tradition of astronomical observation, then the orientation is exactly what you would expect. None of this constitutes proof of anything. It is the kind of pattern recognition that can mislead as easily as it can enlighten, and it needs to be held very lightly. But it is consistent with the physical evidence, and consistency is what you look for when you are assembling the beginnings of a hypothesis. The age question is one that cannot currently be answered with any precision, and that may never be answerable with precision without a proper investigation. The physical evidence gives us indirect indicators rather than direct dates. The depth of the discoveries, in general, correlates with age in the Sydney Basin, where the rate of sedimentation and accumulation is relatively well understood. The depths at which the various elements have been found range from about 4 meters to about 15 meters below current street level. This range encompasses a wide spread of potential ages. The deepest discovery, Merton's chamber at 15 meters, corresponds to a depth that, in the geological context of the Sydney Basin, could represent any period from several hundred years to several thousand. This is not a narrow range, but it is a range that, at its older end, predates European settlement by a margin that makes the colonial-era construction explanation increasingly implausible. There is one specific piece of information in the historical record that places a terminus, a latest possible date, on some portion of the structure. It is buried in a footnote in a geological survey published in 1873, the kind of reference that is almost impossible to find unless you are specifically looking for it, which Helen Forsyth was. The footnote refers to an inspection of a natural sandstone cliff face in the area of what is now the southern part of the central business district, conducted during roadworks in 1871. The inspector, a geologist named Sutherland, noted that the cliff face showed evidence of what he described as prior modification, of tool marks consistent with deliberate shaping that had been partially obscured by subsequent water erosion and mineral deposition. He estimated, based on the depth of the mineral deposition covering the tool marks, that the modification had occurred several centuries before the time of European settlement. Sutherland's estimate was based on visual assessment of mineral deposition rates, which is not a precise dating method. His estimate of several centuries could be substantially wrong in either direction. But it places at least one element of the surface modification of the Sydney Basin sandstone in a pre-colonial period by the assessment of a trained geologist working from physical evidence. This is not nothing. It is the one point in the evidentiary record where a specific dating assessment, even an imprecise one, suggests pre-colonial human activity in the relevant area. The implications of that assessment, if Sutherland was even approximately correct, are significant. They push the origin of the construction into a period of Aboriginal history that is almost entirely undocumented in any written form. The written record of Aboriginal history in Australia begins with European contact, which means that anything that happened before European contact has to be recovered from other sources, from oral tradition, from archaeology, from the geological and ecological record. All of these are legitimate historical sources, but none of them is as legible or as quickly legible as a written document. And the consequence of that illegibility is that the pre-contact history of the Sydney Basin has remained, in the popular understanding of Australian history, a near blank. The sealed city beneath Sydney, if that is what it is part of that blank. It is evidence that has been present, has been encountered repeatedly, and has been filed away each time in a category that makes further inquiry unnecessary. And the blank remains blank, not because there is nothing there, but because there has been no sustained institutional will to fill it in. We have been circling the question of meaning for some time. It is time to approach it more directly. What does it mean if there is, beneath the streets of central Sydney, a pre-colonial constructed environment of significant age and complexity? What does it change? What does it require of us? The first and most obvious implication is historical. The history of Sydney, the history of Australia, is incomplete in a way that is more significant than the ordinary incompleteness of all history. The colonial narrative begins in 1788, as if nothing before that date matters to the understanding of the place. The Mabo decision and its aftermath have complicated that narrative in legal and political terms, establishing that the people who were here before 1788 had rights that the colonial legal order failed to recognize. But the cultural and physical depth of what was here before 1788, what was built, what was known, what was encoded in the landscape, has remained largely uninvestigated. An investigation of the structure beneath central Sydney, even one that produced inconclusive results, would be an act of historical recovery. It would be a decision that the incomplete narrative was insufficient, that the blank deserved to be looked at properly rather than papered over with a bureaucratic categorization. That decision has not been made. The making of it would require political will that has not materialized, professional support from the archaeological community that has been cautious and divided, and agreement from the relevant indigenous communities about the terms on which the investigation should proceed. None of these conditions has been fully met. The second implication is archaeological. If the structure exists and is of significant age, it represents one of the most important archaeological discoveries in Australian history. Not because it would be spectacular in the way that dramatic discoveries in Egypt or Central America are spectacular, but because it would fundamentally alter the understanding of the pre-colonial past. It would require a reassessment of what was possible, of what kinds of technology and cultural organization existed in Aboriginal Australia before European contact. It would require the incorporation of that reassessment into the frameworks of Australian history, education, and heritage management. This would be difficult and disruptive and expensive. It would also be the kind of thing that history is made of. The third implication is ethical. The investigation, if it happens, needs to be conducted in a way that respects the rights of the Gadigal people and the other communities who are the traditional custodians of the land and of the knowledge that pertains to it. This is not just a matter of legal obligation under the various heritage protection laws that apply in New South Wales, though those obligations are real. It is a matter of the basic principle that knowledge of a place belongs, in a meaningful sense, to the people who have lived there and who carry the accumulated understanding of its history. An investigation conducted without the full partnership of the relevant communities would be an act of extraction, taking something from a landscape and a tradition without giving anything back. That kind of extraction is part of what created the situation in the first place. The fourth implication is philosophical. The existence of a pre-colonial constructed environment beneath one of the world's major cities is a fact that disrupts the comfortable modern assumption that the deep past is safely in the past, that what happened before written history is separate from the world we live in and the decisions we make. What lies beneath Sydney, if it is what the evidence suggests, is not separate from the city above. It is the foundation of the foundation. It is part of the physical reality of the place, whether we acknowledge it or not. The decision to acknowledge it or not is itself a historical act, one that will be made at some point and that will have consequences whatever the decision turns out to be. The sealed city is not sealed because of a dramatic conspiracy. It is sealed because of the accumulated weight of 170 years of administrative decisions, each individually defensible, each individually small, and collectively producing an outcome that is very difficult to reverse without the kind of sustained institutional commitment that has not yet materialized. It is the most banal kind of sealed. It is sealed because nobody has decided firmly enough, consistently enough, with enough authority and enough resources that it should be opened. But the stone remembers, and the archives, scattered as they are across the Mitchell Library and the Waterboard records and the project files and the academic papers and the oral history interviews, those archives remember too. They are waiting, as archives always wait, for someone to read them in the right order and ask the right question. The question that the evidence beneath Sydney has been asking for 170 years is simple. It is not a dramatic question. It is not a conspiracy question. It is the most ordinary question that a gap in the historical record can ask. The question is this: what was here before? And the answer, which the evidence suggests but does not yet prove, which the oral tradition implies but cannot confirm, which the ground-penetrating radar detects but cannot interpret, is something was. Something that was cut into the sandstone with precision and intention, something that had passages and chambers and worked surfaces and perhaps astronomical alignments, something that predated the colonial settlement by a margin that we cannot yet determine, but that may be measured in centuries. Something that has been beneath the city all along. The city above does not know it is there. It is built on it without knowing it, walks over it every day without sensing it, buys its coffee and catches its trains and conducts its business on the surface of a question it has never been asked to answer. And the question waits, in the dark, in the sandstone, at depths between 4 and 15 meters beneath the streets of Australia's oldest European city, with the patience of stone. Make of that what you will. Because the decision about what to do with it, about whether to look or not to look, about whether the incomplete narrative is sufficient or whether the blank deserves to be examined, that decision belongs to the people who walk over it every day. It belongs to the city. It belongs to the history that the city is still in the process of becoming. The gap in the official story is not a hole, it is a door. The question is whether anyone is going to open it. Now, let us step back further and consider what the broader context of Australian prehistory tells us about the plausibility of what lies beneath Sydney. Because the sealed city cannot be understood in isolation. It has to be understood against the backdrop of everything else that is being discovered and rediscovered and reinterpreted about the depth of human civilization in Australia. The word civilization is, in this context, controversial. It carries connotations of a particular model of cultural development, a model that was developed in the European intellectual tradition, and that privileges writing, urban settlement, centralized administration, and monumental construction as the markers of complexity. This model has been criticized, rightly, as culturally biased, as a framework that was developed to measure cultures against a European standard and that produces exactly the results it was designed to produce. When you define civilization as something that only looks like European civilization, you find that everything that does not look like European civilization is not civilization. The alternative framework, the one that has been developing in anthropology and archaeology over the past several decades, is one that measures complexity without the European bias. In this framework, the complexity of a culture is measured by the sophistication of its knowledge systems, the depth of its relationship with its environment, the density of its social organization, and the intergenerational continuity of its intellectual traditions. Measured by this standard, Aboriginal Australian cultures are not less complex than the cultures that produced writing and cities and centralized states. They are differently complex. They developed their sophistication in different directions, in directions that were appropriate to the environments they inhabited and the challenges they faced. The aquaculture systems of southeastern Australia, which are now understood to be among the most sophisticated examples of freshwater fish management in the pre-industrial world, are one example of this differently directed complexity. The Budj Bim cultural landscape in Victoria, where the Gunditjmara people constructed a system of stone channels, weirs, and holding ponds that managed the movement of eels across an area of hundreds of square kilometers, represents an engineering achievement comparable in scale and sophistication to the irrigation works of early Mesopotamia. It is dated to approximately 6,600 years ago, which makes it older than the pyramids of Egypt. Budj Bim was not discovered by archaeologists who went looking for it. It was revealed by the Gunditjmara people themselves, who knew it had been there all along and who brought it to the attention of researchers who were finally willing to take indigenous knowledge seriously as a guide to the physical record. The recognition of Budj Bim as a World Heritage Site in 2019 was a moment of historic significance, not because the site had been found, but because the institutional frameworks that assess historical significance had finally expanded enough to accommodate it. The Budj Bim example is relevant to the question of the sealed city beneath Sydney for two reasons. The first is that it demonstrates the existence of ancient engineering traditions in Aboriginal Australia, of the kind that could, in a different geographical and geological context, produce the kind of construction that has been found beneath the Sydney sandstone. The second is that it demonstrates the mechanism by which knowledge of such constructions survives, through the continuous oral and physical traditions of the communities that created them, traditions that were systematically suppressed in the colonial period and that survive only in fragments, but that survive. The Gadigal community's oral tradition, as recorded by Judith Crawford and by earlier observers, does not preserve a detailed technical account of underground construction in the area that became central Sydney. What it preserves are references to the spiritual significance of the underground, to places that are old beyond the reach of living memory, to passages that connect the surface world with something beneath it. These references are encoded in a cultural and spiritual language that is not easy to translate into the categories of Western archaeology. But they are references to something, and the something they refer to corresponds in its general character to what the engineering records describe. The question of how long the knowledge of the underground structure might have been preserved in oral tradition before the colonial disruption is one that cannot be answered precisely. What we know about the capacity of oral tradition to preserve knowledge accurately over very long periods suggests that it is at least possible for knowledge of a constructed environment to be preserved in oral form for many centuries. The astronomical knowledge preserved in Aboriginal Australian traditions, some of which refers to events thousands of years old, suggests that the time horizon of accurate oral preservation in this cultural context is longer than most Western historians have been willing to assume. If the structure beneath Sydney is several centuries old, which Sutherland's geological assessment of the surface tool marks suggests is possible, then the knowledge of it could plausibly have been preserved in the oral traditions of the Gadigal people from the time of its construction through to the moment of colonial contact, through 60 years of colonial disruption, and into the fragments that Crawford recorded in the late 1980s. This is not a certainty, it is a possibility. But it is a possibility that is supported by everything we know about the durability of oral tradition in Aboriginal Australian culture. There is a particular irony in the history of the sealed city that deserves to be named directly. The colonial administration that filed William Carver's discovery without investigation in 1848 was, in a sense, building on a foundation it did not know it had. The sandstone institutions of the colonial city, the churches and government buildings and official residences that were constructed using the sandstone quarried from the very ground in which the passages lay, were drawing their material from the same geological formation that the passages were cut into. The stone of the colonial city and the stone of whatever lay beneath it were the same stone. They were physically continuous. The cut passages and the cut building blocks were made of the same Hawkesbury sandstone, shaped by hands separated by potentially centuries, and assembled into structures that the colony regarded as entirely separate things. The buildings of civilization above, and whatever the strange voids below, were filed away as. This physical continuity is a kind of metaphor for the larger historical continuity that the colonial project tried to interrupt. The present does not begin in 1788. The stone knows this. The question is whether the people who live on it are willing to know it too. We should consider now the specific geological characteristics of the area in which the discoveries have been made, because the geology is not just the backdrop to the story, it is a character in it. The Hawkesbury sandstone of the Sydney Basin is a formation of extraordinary consistency and durability. It was laid down in a vast river delta approximately 230 million years ago during the Triassic period, and it has been geologically stable since that time, which is relatively unusual. Sandstone is generally a soft rock, susceptible to erosion and chemical weathering, but the Hawkesbury formation is cemented with silica rather than calcium carbonate, which makes it considerably more resistant to the water-driven dissolution that gradually destroys carbonate-cemented sandstones. The result is a rock that is strong enough to build in and stable enough to preserve what is built into it or within it over very long periods. What this means, practically, for the question of the passages and chambers, is that a constructed space within the Hawkesbury sandstone would be expected to survive in excellent condition for a very long time, provided it was not actively disturbed. The construction of a passage in sandstone does not require the same kind of ongoing maintenance that prevents a surface building from collapsing. A properly cut passage in sound sandstone is, in the absence of water intrusion or seismic activity, essentially self-maintaining. Once it is cut, it stays. This is relevant to the age question. If the passages were cut several centuries ago, as the indirect evidence suggests is possible, they would be expected to be in good physical condition when they were encountered by 19th and 20th century investigators. The consistency of the descriptions across the different discoveries, the smooth walls, the flat floors, the regular dimensions, is consistent with this expectation. They are not descriptions of decayed or damaged spaces. They are descriptions of spaces that appear to be in the condition they were designed to be in. The geological stability of the Sydney Basin also means that the passages are unlikely to have been created or significantly altered by natural processes in the period since they were cut. Earthquakes are rare and mild in the Sydney region. The water table in the central city area is relatively stable. The physical conditions that would cause a cut space in sandstone to change significantly over centuries are largely absent. This means that what Carver found in 1848 is likely to be substantially the same thing that anyone who looked in the same place today would find. The stone has not forgotten. There is a corollary to this geological stability that is worth noting. The same properties of the Hawkesbury sandstone that make it an excellent medium for preserving a constructed passage also make it difficult to cut with primitive tools. Sandstone in general is soft enough to be worked with stone tools, but the Hawkesbury Formation's silica cementation gives it a hardness and toughness that makes it considerably more challenging to cut than many other sandstones. Cutting a smooth-walled passage through it to the dimensions that Carver described would have required sustained effort over a significant period, and it would have required tools that were capable of producing the smooth, regular surfaces he described. This is relevant because it raises the question of what tools were used. The descriptions of the wall surfaces, consistently described as smoother than is typical of naturally cut sandstone, and different in their surface character from colonial-era tool marks, as Osgood explicitly noted, suggest a cutting method that was not characteristic of either natural geological processes or colonial ironwork. What that cutting method was is unknown. The range of possibilities includes stone tools used with abrasive techniques over long periods, fire setting followed by controlled water quenching to crack the rock in controlled ways, and other methods that have been documented in ancient construction traditions in other parts of the world. All of these methods are capable, given sufficient time and labor, of producing the kind of smooth, regular surfaces described in the historical record. None of them requires any technology that we do not know to have existed in Australia in the pre-colonial period. The tools question is one that a proper archaeological investigation would address as a priority. The tool marks on the walls and floors of the passages, if examined under controlled conditions by a specialist in ancient stone-cutting techniques, would very likely yield significant information about the methods used and, through those methods, about the cultural tradition from which they came. This information is currently inaccessible because the spaces have been backfilled and the accessible surfaces have been covered. It is not gone. It is waiting, as everything about this story is waiting. Let us consider what a proper investigation would look like, not as an advocacy for any particular approach, but as a way of understanding how far we are from an answer and what the path to an answer would require. A proper investigation would begin with a comprehensive review of the historical record, which Forsyth and a small number of other researchers have done, but which has never been done by a team with the resources and institutional backing to produce a comprehensive and authoritative account. It would then move to a systematic program of non-invasive investigation, using the most current geophysical survey methods to map the subsurface in the relevant areas without disturbing what is there. Ground-penetrating radar, seismic tomography, magnetometry. These technologies have advanced considerably since the early 2000s surveys that detected the anomalies, and a current systematic survey would produce considerably more detailed and reliable information about the location and extent of any subsurface structures. This non-invasive phase would require permissions from the various government bodies that manage the relevant subsurface areas, and it would require agreement from the Gadigal community about the terms on which the investigation should proceed. Obtaining those permissions and that agreement would require political will at a level that has not yet been demonstrated. But it would not require any excavation, any physical access to the structures, any disruption of the existing infrastructure. It would require only the willingness to look. If the non-invasive survey produced results consistent with the hypothesis, The next phase would be targeted excavation at locations identified by the survey as offering the best access to the structures with the least disruption to existing infrastructure. This phase would require considerably more negotiation and coordination, and it would require specialist expertise in Aboriginal archaeology and in ancient stone-cutting traditions. It would also require an agreement reached before any excavation began about the treatment of any material found, including any human remains, which are subject to specific protocols under Australian heritage law and under the requirements of free, prior, and informed consent from the relevant communities. This is a feasible investigation. It is not cheap or simple, but it is feasible. The obstacles are not technical, they are institutional and political. The technology to conduct the investigation exists. The expertise to interpret what is found exists, or can be assembled. The legal frameworks that would govern the investigation exist, however imperfectly. What does not yet exist is the decision taken by enough of the relevant institutions with enough authority to act on it that the investigation should happen. The absence of that decision is not permanent. Things change. Institutions change. The accumulation of evidence changes what seems reasonable and necessary. The Budj-Bim recognition did not happen overnight. It happened because of the sustained advocacy of the Gunditj Mara people over many years, combined with the gradual evolution of institutional frameworks that could accommodate their claims. A similar process, driven by the Gadigal community and supported by the researchers who have been assembling the evidence, could produce a similar outcome for the question beneath Sydney. But it has not happened yet, and until it does, the sealed city remains sealed. The night before the first foundation stones of colonial Sydney were laid, something was already beneath the ground. This is not a dramatic statement. It is a simple geological fact. The sandstone was already there, already shaped in ways that the colonists would not discover for 60 years, and would not take seriously for 170 years. The first settlers built on a surface they did not understand. The city grew on foundations they did not examine, and the passages and chambers in the rock continued to exist in the dark, neither advancing nor retreating, simply present, as stone is present, as the past is present, in the places where we choose not to look. The story of what is beneath Sydney is ultimately a story about looking, about the decision to look or not to look, to ask the question or file it away, to take the evidence seriously, or to place it in a category that makes further consideration unnecessary. It is a story about the institutional mechanisms by which the present maintains its preferred narrative about the past, and about the limits of those mechanisms when the evidence accumulates past a certain threshold. The threshold has not been crossed yet. The evidence is there. The evidence has been there for 170 years. But the institutional weight of the preferred narrative has so far been sufficient to keep the question from becoming the investigation it requires. The history of William Carver's diverging field notes, of Patrick Burke's briefly reported discovery, of Harold Osgood's technical appendix, of Douglas Merton's backfilled chamber, of the radar anomalies in the subsurface surveys, is a history of evidence that was found and filed, each time, before it could become a question. But the files do not destroy what they contain, they only store it, and the stone does not forget what was cut into it. These things will be there when the investigation finally happens, whenever that is. They will be in the same condition they have been in for however many centuries they have been there, waiting in the dark beneath the streets of a city that was built, inadvertently, on top of a question it has not yet decided to answer. That is the sealed city beneath Sydney. Not a dramatic secret, not a single dramatic discovery. A pattern of evidence, accumulated over 170 years, pointing toward a question that the institutional frameworks of the city's management have consistently declined to pursue. A question about what was here before. A question written in stone, in the dark, beneath the coffee shops and the train stations and the sandstone buildings of Australia's oldest European city. The stone remembers, the archives remember, the oral tradition remembers, in the fragments that survived the colonial disruption. And the question waits, as it has always waited, with the patience of the geological deep, for someone to decide that the answer matters enough to look for it properly. Make of that what you will, because the city above the sealed city continues. The trains run, the coffee is served, the buildings go up, and the buildings come down. And 37,000 people cross the area above the passages and chambers every weekday, not one of whom knows what is beneath their feet, not one of whom has been given the chance to know, not one of whom has been asked whether they think the question is worth pursuing. Maybe it is time to ask them. The thing about sealed places is that they have a way of insisting on themselves. You can backfill a chamber and repave the street above it. You can file a field note in an archive and close the drawer. You can write the formal report that does not mention what the field notes described and submit it, and receive your salary and move on with your career and never speak of it again. All of that is possible. People do it. People have been doing it in relation to what lies beneath central Sydney for 170 years. But the place is still there, and every few decades, when someone digs in the right location for the right reason, the place is there again, ready to be found, ready to be filed away, ready to wait for the next person to break through the sandstone into the space that should not be there. There is a kind of persistence in the physical record that the administrative record cannot match. The administrative record is made of paper and decisions. The physical record is made of stone. One of them decays, and the other does not. And the one that does not decay has been winning this particular argument for a very long time. We have talked at length about what the evidence suggests about the physical structure beneath Sydney. We have talked about the geology and the historical documentation and the oral tradition and the ground-penetrating radar anomalies. What we have not yet talked about in detail is the second half of the question that the title of this film poses: why it was buried. The why is more speculative than the what, necessarily. We have physical evidence for the existence of the passages and chambers. We do not have a document signed by a colonial official saying we are choosing not to investigate this because it would complicate the narrative of the colony. That document does not exist. What we have instead are patterns of behavior, patterns of administrative decision-making that are consistent with a particular kind of institutional response to a particular kind of uncomfortable discovery. The pattern is as follows. Something is found. The finding is noted in a private record. The private record and the official record diverge at the point of the finding. The official record categorizes the finding in a way that makes further investigation unnecessary. The finding is covered over. Life goes on. This pattern occurred in 1848. It occurred again in 1912. It occurred again in 1937. It occurred again in 1954. The consistency of the pattern across 4 separate events, involving 4 separate institutional actors, with no documented communication between them about the existence of any of the previous events, is itself a kind of evidence. It suggests not a conspiracy, but something more interesting, and in some ways more revealing. An institutional culture that is characterized by the automatic production of a particular response to a particular category of problem. The category of problem is evidence that complicates the colonial narrative. The automatic response is categorize and file. This is not a decision made by a shadowy committee. It is a disposition, an institutional habit, that does not require instruction, because everyone who participates in it shares the same framework for what kinds of things require documentation and investigation and what kinds of things do not. The colonial framework, and to a significant extent its successor, the post-colonial administrative framework, did not include in its categories of things worth investigating the possibility of significant pre-colonial construction in the urban core of the oldest European settlement in Australia. When something was found that might fall into that category, the absence of a category was sufficient to ensure the finding was absorbed into the nearest available adjacent category and filed. This is how institutions maintain their preferred narratives, not by active suppression, though that occurs too, primarily by the passive suppression that comes from having no framework for certain kinds of information, so that when such information arrives, it is automatically redirected into a framework that exists and that does not require inconvenient action. The colonial administration of New South Wales in 1848 had a framework for sandstone geology. It had a framework for convict construction. It had a framework for unexplained subsidence. It did not have a framework for pre-colonial construction of potentially significant age and sophistication, because the existence of such construction was inconsistent with the foundational assumptions of the colonial project. Those foundational assumptions were not examined or questioned. They were simply the air that the administration breathed. And when William Carver came back from underground with field notes that described something the foundational assumptions could not accommodate, the path of least resistance was to ensure that the formal record accommodated the foundational assumptions instead. This analysis is not primarily a criticism of the individuals involved. The colonial administration of New South Wales in 1848 was not composed of unusually bad people. It was composed of people operating within a framework that their society provided them and that they had no particular reason to question. The assumption that Australia before European settlement had nothing of archaeological significance in its ground was not a minority view. It was not a contested claim. It was simply taken for granted. Taking it for granted was not a moral failure. It was the normal epistemic condition of the colonial period. What is a moral question, and a question that remains live, is how we handle the same pattern in the post-colonial period. The administrative responses in 1937 and 1954 occurred after the colonial period, in a nominally more sophisticated framework for historical and archaeological assessment. The response was the same. The categorization and filing was the same. The formal record diverged from the private observations in the same way. This persistent pattern in the post-colonial period is not as easily excused by the epistemic conditions of the time. By 1937, the archaeological investigation of Indigenous Australian history was an established field. By 1954, the principles of what would later become the legislative framework for heritage protection were beginning to be articulated. The decisions made in those years to categorize and file, rather than to investigate, were made in a context where investigation was possible and where its significance could have been understood. The decision not to investigate was still not, in either case, a conscious conspiracy, but it was, to a greater degree than in the colonial period, a decision. The decision in 1954 is the one that sits least comfortably in retrospect. Douglas Merton, the engineer who found the chamber during the railway extension work, was a mid-20th century professional with a good education and no particular hostility to Aboriginal history. His project notes describe what he found with precision and honesty. He did not hide his discovery. He filed it in the standard way, referred it to the Department of Lands for further action, and presumably expected that further action to occur. The further action did not occur. The failure to act was not Merton's failure. It was the Department of Lands' failure, or the failure of whoever at the Department of Lands received the referral and decided, in the quiet of an office in 1954, that this was not a priority. We do not know who that person was. We do not know what they thought when they read the referral. We do not know if they knew about the previous discoveries, which they almost certainly did not. We know only that no action was taken, and that no action has been taken since. The question of who is responsible for the perpetual non-investigation of what lies beneath Sydney is, in the end, unanswerable in terms of individuals. The responsibility is institutional, structural, cultural. It is the responsibility of a series of frameworks, colonial and post-colonial, that did not provide an adequate category for the thing that was being found, and that therefore absorbed each finding into a category that required no follow-up and produced no knowledge. This is changing, slowly. The intellectual frameworks for understanding Aboriginal Australian history have been expanding, and continue to expand, in ways that are creating the possibility of a different kind of response to the evidence beneath Sydney. The Budge Bim recognition, to return to that example, was not possible before the frameworks changed. Once the frameworks changed, it became not just possible but seemingly obvious, the kind of thing that everyone involved wondered why it had not happened sooner. The same evolution of frameworks could in time produce the same outcome for the question beneath Sydney. But time matters. The oral tradition that connects the Gadigal community to whatever knowledge their ancestors may have held about the underground is fragmenting. The elders who hold the most complete versions of that tradition are aging. The window for recovering that knowledge and incorporating it into the investigation as an equal partner to the physical evidence is not unlimited. If the investigation happens in 20 years rather than now, it may happen without the oral tradition as a guide. And the investigation without the oral tradition is a significantly lesser investigation. This is a kind of urgency that the institutional frameworks have not yet acknowledged. The urgency of the stone is nil. The stone will wait. The urgency of the knowledge is considerable. Knowledge held in human memory is mortal. It dies with the people who hold it. The decision to delay the investigation is, in its effect, if not in its intention, a decision to allow that knowledge to become less accessible with each passing year. It is worth dwelling for a moment on the specific landscape above the sealed city, because the geography of the surface is itself part of the story. The area of central Sydney, directly above the zone where the various discoveries have been made, is one of the most intensively developed urban landscapes in Australia. The streets above the passages and chambers carry heavy pedestrian and vehicle traffic. The subsurface is threaded with infrastructure: water mains, gas lines, electrical conduits, telecommunications cables, stormwater drains, sewers, railway tunnels. The density of existing infrastructure is one of the practical reasons that investigation has been difficult to pursue. The ground is already so full of things that accessing whatever is in it at deeper levels requires both careful planning and significant expense. The same landscape is also the location of some of the most important historical sites in Australian colonial history. The area of the rocks, adjacent to the Circular Quay waterfront, contains some of the oldest surviving buildings in Sydney. Buildings that are themselves part of the heritage record of the colonial period. The tension between the heritage of the colonial period and the potential heritage of the pre-colonial period is one that is not acknowledged explicitly in any of the heritage management frameworks that apply to the area, but that is nonetheless real and structurally present in any discussion of investigation. There is an irony, visible once it has been pointed out, in the fact that the buildings above the potential pre-colonial heritage are protected as colonial heritage, while the potential pre-colonial heritage beneath them has no protection at all. The legislative frameworks that protect the colonial buildings from inappropriate alteration do not extend to protecting what may lie beneath them. This is not a conspiracy. It is a consequence of the fact that the frameworks were developed to protect what was known to be there, and what was known to be there was colonial. The pre-colonial was unknown, and the frameworks did not need to protect what was unknown, because the frameworks assumed that there was nothing to protect. This circularity, the frameworks do not protect the unknown. The unknown remains unknown because there is no investigation. There is no investigation because the frameworks do not provide for it, is the structural core of the administrative impasse. Breaking the circularity requires someone to act outside the established frameworks, to take the initiative of treating an unprotected unknown as if it were a protected known, at least to the extent of investigating whether it exists and what it might be. This is a politically risky action for anyone within the relevant institutions. It is the kind of action that requires a particular combination of professional courage and institutional support that has not yet materialized. But it can materialize. These are not impossible conditions. The conditions for the Budj-Bim recognition were not present for decades, and then they were. The conditions change. The frameworks evolve. The people within the institutions who are willing to take the risk that the recognition of something unknown requires become more numerous or more senior or both. The evidence beneath Sydney is not going anywhere. It will still be there when the conditions change. The question is only whether the change comes before or after the oral tradition that might help interpret it becomes too fragmentary to be recoverable. Let us now consider the question of what we know precisely about the pre-colonial history of the specific area above the sealed city. This is a question that takes us into territory that is, in most popular accounts of Sydney's history, entirely absent. The pre-colonial history of the central city area is not taught in schools. It is not interpreted at heritage sites. It is not acknowledged in the design of the built environment above it. It exists, where it exists at all in public consciousness, as a kind of general acknowledgement that people were here before the British, without any specificity about who those people were, what they knew, or what their relationship to the specific landscape of the central city was. The Gadigal people's traditional relationship to the southern shore of Port Jackson, the area that became central Sydney, was intimate and complex. They were not a population that used the landscape lightly. They had names for every significant feature of the terrain, names that encoded information about the character and resources of the places named. They had detailed knowledge of the seasonal patterns of the area, of the movements of the fish in the harbour, of the distribution of the shellfish beds, of the locations of the freshwater sources. They had spiritual relationships with the landscape that integrated the physical and the metaphysical in ways that Western frameworks for heritage management are only beginning to develop categories for. The landscape was not, for the Gadigal, simply a surface to be lived on. It was a text to be read, a map to be understood, a record of history to be interpreted. And the underground, where the passages and chambers were, was part of that landscape in a way that is not captured by any of the instrumental categories of the colonial heritage record. The Gadigal's spiritual geography included specific references to places beneath the surface, to passages and chambers that were described in terms consistent with the physical descriptions in the engineering records. These references have been noted, above, in Judith Crawford's oral history work, but they are not isolated examples. Earlier observers, working in the late 19th century, recorded similar references in the accounts of community members who had maintained closer connection to the oral tradition in its fuller form. The pattern of these references is worth examining. They do not describe the underground spaces in terms of danger or prohibition, in the way that spaces associated with death or malevolent spiritual forces are typically described in Aboriginal Australian oral tradition. They describe them in terms of age and significance, of great depth in time, of a connection to something that preceded the present order of things. This is the kind of description associated, in many Aboriginal traditions, with places of ceremony, of initiation, of the kinds of significant cultural transaction that are performed at particular places in the landscape, because those places have been recognized as appropriate for them over very long periods. If the underground spaces were places of ceremony, that would explain several things. It would explain the consistent scale of the elements described, the chambers large enough for gatherings, the passages connecting them, the niches in the walls that could serve as storage or as positions of honor, the circular depression in the floor that could be the focus of a ritual space. It would explain the apparent care with which the spaces were cut, the smoothness of the surfaces that persisted over centuries, suggesting that the cutting was done deliberately and was not a purely functional act. It would explain the astronomical orientation, if that is what the northeast to southwest axis represents, because ceremonial spaces in many traditions are oriented to astronomically significant directions as a way of connecting the human ceremony with the cycles of the sky. This hypothesis, that the sealed city beneath Sydney was a complex of ceremonial spaces rather than, or in addition to, a functional infrastructure, is not provable on the current evidence. But it is consistent with the evidence and with the cultural context, and it is the kind of hypothesis that a proper investigation would be designed to test. The hypothesis also raises a specific and uncomfortable question about the implications of the investigation. If the spaces are ceremonial, they may contain, or may once have contained, material that is of significant cultural and spiritual significance to the Gadigal community. The protocols for the handling of such material and for the investigation of spaces that may contain it are specific and well established in Australian law and in the requirements of free, prior, and informed consent from the relevant communities. An investigation conducted without full partnership with the Gadigal community would not only be legally problematic, it would be ethically wrong in a way that the history of the colonial treatment of this landscape makes particularly pointed. This is not a reason not to investigate. It is a reason to investigate in a particular way, a way that places the Gadigal community at the center of the investigation rather than at its margins. The community holds knowledge that the archaeological record cannot supply. The archaeological record contains information that the oral tradition cannot confirm. The two together have the potential to produce an understanding that neither could achieve alone. But the investigation requires the partnership to be genuine, not the kind of notional consultation that involves informing community members of decisions already made, but the kind of full partnership that involves community members in defining the questions, determining the methods, interpreting the findings, and deciding what is made public and what is held in confidence. This kind of partnership is possible. It has been practiced in other contexts in Australia and is producing results that neither party could have achieved independently. It requires time, and it requires the willingness of the institutional parties to accept that the Gadigal community has an authority over this investigation that is not simply a matter of legal obligation, but a matter of the fundamental legitimacy of the inquiry. An investigation of the sealed city beneath Sydney that is not conducted in genuine partnership with the Gadigal people is not just legally inadequate. It is historically inappropriate, given that the story of the sealed city is, among other things, a story about the consequences of the colonial habit of conducting investigations of places and peoples without the knowledge or consent of those most directly connected to them. The sealed city has been sealed, in the end, not just by backfill and concrete and administrative inertia. It has been sealed by the same colonial habit of mind that sealed the entire pre-colonial history of the continent. The habit of treating the knowledge of indigenous peoples as irrelevant to the understanding of their own landscape. That habit is changing. It has not finished changing, but it is changing. And when the change is complete enough, the sealed city will be opened, and the question it has been asking since William Carver wrote carefully on page 43 of his field notes in 1848 will begin to receive the answer it has been waiting for. The stone remembers, the archives remember, the oral tradition in the fragments that survive remembers. And the question is there, in the dark, in the Hawkesbury sandstone, at depths between 4 and 15 meters, waiting with the patience of the geological deep. Make of that what you will, but understand what you are making of it. You are making of it a decision about the kind of city Sydney chooses to be, the kind of history it chooses to have, the kind of relationship it chooses to maintain with everything that was here before the first ships sailed into Port Jackson. You are making of it a decision about whether the incomplete narrative is sufficient, or whether the blank deserves to be examined, honestly and carefully, and in partnership with the people who have been living above it and alongside it and within it for 65,000 years. That decision is not made in the dark, in the passages and chambers beneath the streets. It is made above, in the daylight, by the people who walk over the sealed city every day without knowing it is there. Now they know it is there. The question is what they do with that knowledge. There are certain kinds of discoveries that change the way you see a place. Not dramatic discoveries, necessarily. Not discoveries that make the evening news or prompt parliamentary inquiries. The most important discoveries are often quiet ones. A page in an archive, a note in an appendix, a pattern in the numbers from a survey conducted for entirely different reasons. The discovery of the sealed city beneath Sydney has been a series of quiet discoveries over a very long time. And the cumulative effect of those quiet discoveries is to make it impossible for anyone who has encountered them to look at the streets of the central city in the same way again. Walking over Circular Quay, knowing what Harold Osgood found in 1937 at 8 meters below the surface, changes the experience of the place. Not dramatically, but in the way that knowing the history of a building changes the experience of standing in it. You see the surface differently when you know what is beneath the surface. The ordinary becomes layered. The present becomes the top of a deep stack of time. Sydney presents itself as a young city. It is, by the standards of the world's major cities, young. It is a little over 200 years old as a European settlement. But the land it sits on is not young, and the human presence on that land is not young. The human presence on the land that became Sydney is 65,000 years old. That is not a rounding error. That is not a number that can be assimilated into the conventional narrative of a young city without changing what that narrative means. The sealed city is a representation of that time depth. It is a representation of what it means for the land beneath a city to have been shaped by human hands over a period that the city's official history does not acknowledge. The passages and chambers in the sandstone are not merely archaeological curiosities. They are evidence of a civilization, in the broader sense of that word, that was sophisticated enough to modify its underground environment in ways that have persisted for centuries, sophisticated enough to encode the significance of that modification in an oral tradition that has survived in fragments through the most severe disruption that any culture can face, and sophisticated enough to have given its landscape names and meanings that were still being recorded in fragments by sympathetic observers 150 years after the disruption began. The word civilization, when applied to pre-colonial Aboriginal Australian culture, continues to be contested in some quarters. This contestation says more about the limitations of the concept than about the reality of the cultures it is reluctantly applied to. A culture that has maintained continuous occupation of the same landscape for 65,000 years, that has developed sophisticated ecological management techniques, that has preserved astronomical knowledge across a time span that dwarfs the entire recorded history of Western civilization, that has maintained a living tradition of cultural and spiritual practice through 60 years of the most aggressive disruption imaginable, is a civilization by any standard that is worth applying. The sealed city beneath Sydney is evidence of that civilization, evidence that has been present in the physical record since the first colonial infrastructure workers broke into the passage in 1848, evidence that has been filed and forgotten each time it was encountered, evidence that is still there, still waiting, still asking its quiet and fundamental question about what was here before. The city above does not yet know the answer, but the city above now knows the question, and knowing the question is the beginning of the kind of investigation that the stone has been waiting for, with the patience of the geological deep, for 170 years. Let us go back one more time, in conclusion, to William Carver. Let us think about what it was like to be William Carver on that day in August 1848, when he broke through into the passage in the sandstone and found himself in a space that should not have been there. He was a professional. He was in the middle of a routine survey. He had been documenting geological conditions in the central city area for weeks, and the work had been exactly as expected. And then the unexpected happened. He was confronted with evidence that did not fit any of the frameworks he had been given. He was 40 feet into a passage that had been cut through the sandstone by hands that were not colonial hands, looking at marks on the walls that he could not interpret, standing in a space that was real and present and utterly outside the categories of his world. He wrote it down. He wrote it down carefully, choosing every word, aware that what he was recording was not ordinary. That is what professionals do. That is what honesty requires. He wrote it down and then he went back to the surface and submitted the formal report that did not mention it. That is what institutional membership requires, when the institution does not have a category for what you found. The tension between those two things, writing it down and then not submitting it, is the tension that runs through the entire story of the sealed city. The tension between the honesty of the individual record and the categories of the institutional record. The tension between what is found and what the framework can accommodate. Carver held that tension, alone, for the rest of his professional life. He never spoke about it again. The passage under his feet and the notebook in his desk existed in different worlds that could not be reconciled. That tension has not been resolved. It has been extended across 170 years, through a series of individuals, each of whom encountered the same problem and resolved it in the same way, by maintaining the honest record privately while allowing the official record to categorize and file. Merton's project notes. Osgood's appendix. These are the private honest records of people who found something they did not know how to resolve within their institutional context. What changes the situation is not a dramatic revelation. It is not a single discovery that breaks the impasse. It is the accumulation of those private, honest records to a point where they can no longer be dismissed as isolated anomalies, where the pattern they reveal is too consistent to be explained by coincidence, where the convergence of the physical evidence and the oral tradition and the documentary record forces a question that the institutional frameworks can no longer redirect into the nearest available category. We are at or near that point. The evidence has accumulated. The frameworks are changing. The question is there, and the stone is still there, in the dark, at depths between 4 and 15 meters, shaped by hands that knew the landscape 65,000 years ago and modified it in ways that have persisted to the present. The sealed city beneath Sydney is not merely an archaeological mystery, it is a mirror held up to the city above it. It reflects back the question of what the city is built on, literally and historically. It asks whether the foundations of the city's identity, the self-understanding of a young European settlement in an ancient land, can accommodate the reality that the ancient land was not blank when the settlement arrived. It asks whether the narrative of the city's beginning can be extended backward into the 65,000 years before 1788 without requiring the city to become something other than itself. The answer to that question is yes. The city can hold the longer narrative without losing its own character. The history of European settlement in Sydney is real and significant and part of what the city is. The history of pre-colonial occupation, which the passages and chambers in the sandstone represent, is also real and significant, and also part of what the city is. The two histories do not cancel each other out. They do not compete for the right to be the only history. They coexist, as the surface and the underground coexist, as the present and the deep past coexist, as the written record and the oral tradition coexist. The sealed city is asking to be unsealed, not in the sense of being opened by excavation and emptied of its evidence, but in the sense of being acknowledged, investigated, incorporated into the understanding of the place above it. It is asking to be part of the story of the city, rather than a gap in it. It is asking the city to expand its self-understanding enough to accommodate the 65,000 years that preceded the 225 years that the city currently acknowledges. That is not a small ask. It requires a revision of what the city thinks it is and where it thinks it begins. But it is an honest ask, grounded in physical evidence that has been there all along, waiting in the dark, in the sandstone, under the streets and the coffee shops and the train stations and the sandstone buildings of Australia's oldest European city. The stone remembers. The question is whether the city is ready, finally, to remember with it. Make of that what you will. The night falls on Sydney as it has fallen on the same patch of earth for 65,000 nights of nights. The harbour reflects the lights of a city that does not know what is beneath it. A city built on foundations that were shaped before its builders were born, walking its streets above passages that wait in the dark with the patience of the geological deep. The trains run. The people walk. The coffee is served. The buildings cast their shadows on streets that cast their shadows on stone that was cut by hands. The city has not yet decided to acknowledge. In the morning, 37,000 people will cross the zone above the passages and chambers. Not one of them will know it. Not one of them will feel the hollow in the stone beneath their feet, the space that should not be there in the Hawkesbury sandstone, the space that William Carver found and filed and never spoke of again. But now you know it is there. And knowing it is there changes what you see when you look at the surface. It layers the ordinary with the deep. It makes the present the top of a very long stack of time. It makes the silence beneath the city a different kind of silence. Not the silence of emptiness, but the silence of something waiting to be asked. The sealed city beneath Sydney is not going anywhere. It will be there tomorrow and in 100 years and in 1,000. The stone does not forget. The archives do not forget. The oral tradition, in the fragments that survive, does not forget. And the question does not go away. It is there, in the dark, under the streets, asking what the city is built on. And the city, above it, carries on in the light, not yet having given the answer that the question deserves. That is the story of the sealed city beneath Sydney. It is a story without a satisfying resolution, because the resolution has not happened yet. It is a story that is still open, still unfinished, still waiting for the decision that would turn a pattern of evidence into a proper investigation, and a proper investigation into the kind of knowledge that changes what a city knows about itself. The stone remembers. It is waiting for the rest of the story. And when the investigation finally comes, when the frameworks have evolved enough and the political will has materialized enough and the partnership with the Gadigal community is genuine enough, what will be found in the passages and chambers beneath central Sydney will not destroy the story of the city. It will complete it. It will give the city the foundation it has been walking on without knowing it, the 65,000 years of human presence in this specific landscape that preceded the 200 years of recorded history, and that the recorded history has been covering over, inadvertently and systematically, since the first buildings went up on the sandstone shores of Port Jackson. The city will be bigger when it knows what is beneath it, and the knowledge, when it finally comes, will not make the present smaller. It will make it richer, deeper, more honest, more truly what it is. The most recent layer of the longest story of human presence in this landscape, a story that began 65,000 years ago and is still being written by the people who walk above the sealed city every day, not yet knowing, but beginning to wonder what it is they are walking on. Make of that what you will. The passages are there, the archives are there, the oral tradition is there, in its fragments. The question is there. The rest is up to you. There is a conversation that happens in the academic literature on colonial history about what is called the archaeology of silence. The phrase was coined by researchers who noticed that the absence of evidence in the colonial record is itself a kind of evidence, that the gaps in the documentation are patterned rather than random, that the silences fall consistently around the same kinds of subjects, and that this consistency tells us something important about the structures of power that produce the documentation. The archaeology of silence is not a mystical concept. It is a practical methodology. You identify the gaps. You ask who would have produced documentation of the missing subject if the subject had been acknowledged. You ask what prevented that documentation from being produced. You ask who benefited from the silence. And you use the pattern of the silence, its shape and its consistency and its duration, as evidence of the thing it is silent about. Applied to the sealed city beneath Sydney, the archaeology of silence produces a specific and telling result. The silence falls consistently around the question of pre-colonial construction in the central city area. It falls in the colonial period, in 1848, when Carver's field notes diverge from the formal report. It falls in the early colonial period successor framework in 1912, when Patrick Bourke's discovery is published briefly in 4 column inches and then not followed up. It falls in the mid-century administrative framework in 1937 and 1954, when Osgood's appendix and Merton's notes are filed without follow-up. And it falls in the contemporary period, in the early 2000s, when the ground-penetrating radar anomalies are noted and referred for further investigation if work in the area proceeds, which it does not. The silence is not random. It is shaped by the question it avoids. And the question it avoids is the same in every instance. What was here before, and who made it? This consistent avoidance of a specific question across 170 years of otherwise well-documented administrative and engineering activity is not what random silence looks like. Random silence is scattered. It falls across many subjects inconsistently. The silence around the pre-colonial construction question is systematic. It is reproduced each time the subject arises, by different individuals in different institutional contexts, without coordination and apparently without awareness of the previous silences. This is what institutional silence looks like when it is produced by structural frameworks rather than individual decisions. Each individual who participated in the silencing was, in their own context, making a reasonable decision given the frameworks they were operating within. The colonial surveyor in 1848 did not have a framework for pre-colonial construction. The newspaper reporter in 1912 did not have a category for the kind of discovery Bourke described. The water board bureaucrat in 1937 who received Osgood's report did not have a process for following up on anomalous geological features that did not present an immediate structural risk. The Department of Lands official in 1954 who received Merton's referral did not have a mandate that covered the investigation of potentially pre-colonial underground chambers found during railway construction. In each case, the individual had every institutional reason to do exactly what they did, and no institutional reason to do otherwise. The silence was the system working as designed, and the design did not include a space for the thing that was being found. What happens when a design does not include a space for something? The something accumulates at the edges. It is filed into the nearest adjacent category. It sits in archives, waiting for someone who is looking for it specifically, looking for it because they have a reason to expect it to be there. William Carver's field notes were in the Mitchell Library for 150 years before Helen Forsyth found them. Osgood's appendix was in the Waterboard archive for 60 years before she found it too. These are not documents that were hidden. They are documents that were filed in the ordinary way, in archives that are publicly accessible, available to anyone who knew to look for them. The question is, who would know to look? Someone who already suspects that there is something to find. Someone who has a reason to think that the archive might contain evidence of pre-colonial construction in the central city area. Someone who has, in other words, already begun to think outside the framework that produced the silences. Forsyth was that person. She was working, in the late 1990s, in a context where the Mabo decision had changed the legal landscape in ways that were beginning to change the intellectual landscape as well. She was working at a moment when the frameworks for understanding Aboriginal Australian history were, for the first time in the history of the discipline, genuinely open to the possibility that the pre-colonial past of the continent might be more complex and more varied than the colonial narrative had allowed. She was looking for something different from what she found, and what she found was different from what she expected. But she was prepared to take it seriously in a way that none of the previous finders had been institutionally prepared to do. This is the mechanism of historical recovery. It does not happen through dramatic revelation. It happens through the gradual expansion of the frameworks within which researchers work, until the frameworks are large enough to accommodate the evidence that has been accumulating in the archives all along. The evidence does not change. The archives do not change. What changes is the capacity of researchers to recognize the evidence and to have an institutional context within which they can bring it to the surface. We are in the early stages of that expansion in relation to the sealed city beneath Sydney. The expansion is not complete. The investigation has not happened. But the preconditions for the investigation are being established. The frameworks are changing. The evidence is in the archive. The oral tradition is in the memories of community members who are, in some cases, willing to share it. The technology to conduct a non-invasive investigation exists and is improving. The legal frameworks for conducting such an investigation in genuine partnership with the relevant communities exist, however imperfectly. What is needed is the decision that the investigation should happen. That decision is a political and institutional act. It requires someone with the authority to initiate an investigation and the courage to accept the results, whatever they turn out to be. It requires the agreement of the Gadigal community to the terms on which the investigation proceeds. It requires the cooperation of the various infrastructure bodies whose assets overlie the relevant areas. It requires funding that is not currently allocated. None of these requirements is impossible. They are the ordinary requirements of institutional action on a significant heritage investigation. They have been met in other contexts. They can be met in this one. The question is when. The when depends on factors that are outside the scope of what the evidence can determine. It depends on political will, on institutional priorities, on the evolution of community relationships, on funding decisions that are made in contexts far removed from the specific question of the sealed city. It depends, in the end, on what the people who have the authority to initiate the investigation decide to prioritize. But the evidence is there, the question is there, the stone is there, and the story of what lies beneath the streets of Australia's oldest European city is not finished. It has barely begun. Let us consider one final dimension of the sealed city story before we reach the end of what can currently be said about it. It is a dimension that is rarely discussed in the academic literature, partly because it is harder to document, and partly because it touches on things that the academic literature is generally uncomfortable touching. It is the dimension of what it means, to the people who walk above it, to live above a sealed question. Sydney is a city with a particular relationship to its own history. It is, in one sense, very comfortable with its history, proud of its colonial heritage, proud of its 200 years of European settlement, proud of the sandstone buildings and the harbour bridge and the opera house. It is a city that knows its own story and tells it with confidence. But beneath that confidence there is something that Sydney-siders, if they are honest with themselves, can sometimes feel without being able to name. It is the discomfort of a story that begins too abruptly, the discomfort of a beginning that is also a dispossession, a founding that is also a displacement. The story of Sydney begins in 1788 with arrival, and the arrival is a beginning only if you are willing to treat what was here before the arrival as not yet a beginning, as something other than history. The sealed city is the physical representation of that discomfort. It is what was here before, not as mythology or sentiment, but as stone, as worked passage, as chamber, as flat floor and smooth walls, and niches, and circular depression, as something that was made by someone who knew the landscape before the landscape had a European name, as something that persisted through the colonial period and the post-colonial period and the contemporary period, unchanged, in the dark, beneath the streets that were named by people who never knew it was there. To know about the sealed city is to know about the discomfort in a more concrete form. It is to know that the story that begins in 1788 does not begin in 1788. It begins at least several centuries earlier, and possibly much earlier than that. And the beginning that everyone knows is not the beginning at all, but an interruption, a dramatic and violent interruption in a much longer story. This is not comfortable knowledge. It requires something of the people who hold it. It requires them to hold their city's history in a way that accommodates a deeper past, to understand the place they live in as a place that was shaped by human hands for much longer than the history books acknowledge, to accept that the identity of the city is incomplete if it does not include the identity of the country in which the city was built. These are not small requirements. They are the requirements of historical honesty. And historical honesty about the foundations of colonial settlement in Australia is a project that the country has been undertaking, with difficulty and with variable commitment, for several decades. The sealed city is one more chapter in that project, a chapter that happens to be written in stone at depths between 4 and 15 meters in the geological heart of the oldest European city in the country. The project of historical honesty about Australia's past is not going to be completed by an archaeological investigation of the passages and chambers beneath central Sydney. It is a much larger project than that. But the investigation, if it happens, will be a significant contribution to it. Not because it will answer the question definitively, but because asking the question at all, pursuing it with the seriousness it deserves, committing to the partnership with the Gadigal community that the investigation requires, is itself an act of historical honesty. It is a decision that the incomplete narrative is not sufficient, that the blank deserves to be looked at, that the stone deserves to be read. That decision has not yet been made, but the evidence is ready for it. The stone is ready for it. The archives are ready for it. And the oral tradition, in the fragments that survive, is ready for it. The sealed city beneath Sydney is waiting. It has been waiting for 170 years, since William Carver stood in the passage in August 1848 and wrote carefully on page 43 of his field notes about what he found there. It will wait longer if it has to. Stone is patient in ways that people are not. The passages and chambers in the Hawkesbury sandstone have been there through the entire history of Sydney as a European city. They were there when the first convicts were building the settlement above. They were there when the first sandstone government buildings went up. They were there through the Gold Rush and the Federation and 2 World Wars and the building of the Harbour Bridge and the Opera House. They are there now, under the coffee shops and the train stations and the office towers and the tourist infrastructure of a 21st century global city. They will still be there when the investigation finally happens. That is the one thing about this story that is certain. The stone will wait. The question will wait. The opportunity to answer it correctly, in partnership with the people who have been walking above it for 65,000 years, will remain available as long as the oral tradition that connects the present community to the knowledge of the past continues to survive. The window is not unlimited, but it is still open. That is the story of the sealed city beneath Sydney. A city beneath the city, or the remnants of one, sealed by administrative decisions made across 170 years by people who did not know they were sealing it, who were simply operating within frameworks that did not include a space for what had been found. Sealed by the weight of a preferred narrative. Sealed by the institutional inertia of the colonial and post-colonial administrative systems. Sealed by the sandstone itself, which does not change, which does not forget, which holds what was placed in it with the patience of the geological deep, but known now to a wider circle of people than it was known to yesterday. Spoken of in documents and papers and interviews and this account in ways that make the pattern of the evidence visible, joined in the public record to the oral tradition that has always known it was there, that has always described the underground of Port Jackson in terms that correspond with a correspondence that is not coincidence to what the engineering records describe. The sealed city is still sealed, but it is less thoroughly sealed than it was before the evidence was assembled and the question was asked in the form in which it is being asked now. The seal has been loosened, a little, by the accumulation of the record and the asking of the question. And each time the question is asked, by each person who encounters the evidence and takes it seriously and passes it on, the seal is loosened a little more, until, finally, the city above makes the decision that the city below has been waiting for. Until the investigation happens, until the stone is read. The stone is patient. The question is not going anywhere. The rest is up to you. Now let us talk about the city that was sealed, and try to understand it not just as a historical problem or an administrative failure or an archaeological question, but as what it actually is, a place. A place that someone made at some point in the deep past, for reasons we cannot yet determine with certainty, in a landscape that they knew with an intimacy that the city which replaced them has never matched. What was the Sydney Basin like when the passages and chambers were cut? This is a question that geology and archaeology and paleoclimatology can address, not with the specificity that would satisfy everyone, but with enough confidence to draw a general picture. The Sydney Basin, in the centuries before European contact, was a landscape of extraordinary ecological richness. Port Jackson, the harbour that would later be described by the arriving Europeans as one of the finest natural harbours in the world, was a place of abundant marine resources. Fish, shellfish, seabirds, marine mammals. The southern shore, where the Gadigal lived, offered access to these resources, along with the fresh water of the Tank Stream and the other small creeks that ran down from the sandstone ridges into the harbour. The sandstone ridges themselves, now largely built over, were covered with heath and scrub and the eucalypt woodland that was characteristic of the Sydney Basin. A landscape that supported a variety of plant foods, from seeds and tubers to berries and greens. The harbour was the organising feature of the landscape. The groups that lived around it oriented their lives to its rhythms, the seasonal patterns of the fish and the shellfish, the tidal cycles, the patterns of weather that came off the water. The landscape was not simply inhabited. It was managed in the sense of being actively shaped to maintain its productivity through techniques that included controlled burning to promote the growth of food plants, the management of shellfish beds through selective harvesting, and the maintenance of the waterways that connected the different parts of the country. Into this landscape, in the sandstone beneath the southern shore of the harbour, someone cut passages and chambers. The cutting was, as we have established, technically demanding. The silica-cemented Hawkesbury sandstone is not easy stone to work. The production of smooth walls and flat floors and regular dimensions over the distances described requires sustained effort and a degree of technical knowledge about the properties of the stone and the methods best suited to working it. What tools were used? The pre-colonial toolkit in the Sydney Basin has been extensively studied, and it includes a range of stone implements that were capable, in skilled hands, of producing very fine work in hard materials. The technique of grinding, using abrasive stones to smooth surfaces, is well documented in the Australian archaeological record and is capable of producing the kind of smooth surface that Carver and the others described. Fire setting, the technique of applying fire to the stone face to fracture it and then using tools to remove the fractured material, is also documented and would produce a different kind of surface texture. The combination of the two, fire setting to remove material and then grinding to smooth the resulting surface, is capable of producing the smooth, regular walls described in the historical record. This is not speculation. These are documented techniques. They are techniques that required skill and knowledge and sustained effort, and that produced results that the 19th and 20th century investigators consistently found remarkable. The smoothness of the walls was, in every account, something that the observers were moved to note specifically. Not because it was impossible, but because it was not what they expected to find. What else was in the passages and chambers? The historical accounts describe the walls, the floor, the ceiling, the niches, and the circular depression. They describe what they could see in the light available to them, which was, in every case, the light of a candle or an electric torch, both of which are sufficient for general observation, but insufficient for the kind of detailed examination that would reveal whether there are traces of pigment on the walls, or traces of material in the niches, or evidence of what was placed in the circular depression. The possibility that the walls were painted cannot be assessed from the historical descriptions. Cave paintings in sandstone are well documented in the Australian archaeological record, in many locations around the Sydney Basin and elsewhere. If the underground spaces were ceremonial, which the architectural evidence is consistent with, the presence of painting on the walls would be expected. The absence of any report of painting in the historical accounts does not mean the painting was absent. It may mean that the pigment had faded beyond the visibility of a candle or torch in the limited time available to the investigators, or it may mean there was none. A proper investigation would be able to determine this. The niches in the walls of Merton's chamber are intriguing. Niches in walls are, in many architectural traditions, places where objects of significance are placed. The size of the niches, Merton described, approximately 1/2 meter square, is consistent with the storage or display of objects in the range of things that would be significant in a ceremonial context. Whether anything remains in those niches, after the passage of however many centuries, and after the backfill operation of 1954, is unknown. It is possible. Organic material would likely not survive. Stone or shell objects might. The circular depression in the floor is the feature most obviously consistent with a ceremonial function. Circular depressions or platforms at the center of ceremonial spaces are documented in many traditions and in many parts of the world. They serve as the focus of the ceremony, the point around which the ceremony organizes itself, sometimes as fire pits, sometimes as the location of a sacred object, sometimes as the symbol of the thing that the ceremony is about. In the specific context of the Sydney Basin and the traditions of the Eora Nation, the precise significance of such a feature cannot be determined without the knowledge held by the community. What can be said is that it is not a feature characteristic of any utilitarian construction, and that its presence in the chamber is consistent with the hypothesis that the chamber was a ceremonial space. All of this is hypothetical. It is the kind of hypothesis that is generated by looking at the available evidence and asking what it is most consistent with. The hypothesis will remain a hypothesis until the investigation happens. But it is a hypothesis with a foundation in the evidence, and it is the kind of hypothesis that an investigation would be designed to test. The sealed city beneath Sydney is, at this point in the story, a hypothesis supported by an unusual degree of convergent evidence. Physical observations by multiple independent investigators across a century and a half. Documentary evidence of administrative decisions that consistently avoided the implications of those observations. Geological survey data from non-invasive methods that confirm the presence of subsurface anomalies in the relevant areas. Oral tradition from the community with the longest and most intimate relationship with the landscape, referring to underground spaces in terms that are consistent with the physical descriptions. A specific geological assessment that places at least some of the surface tool marks in a pre-colonial period. This is not proof, but it is more than enough to justify an investigation. In any other context, this accumulation of converging evidence from multiple independent sources would be considered sufficient justification for a serious inquiry. The reason the inquiry has not been conducted is not that the evidence is insufficient. It is that the institutional frameworks within which the decision to conduct an inquiry would be made have not yet expanded enough to accommodate the question the evidence is asking. That expansion is happening. It has been happening, gradually. Since the Mabo decision of 1992, it will continue to happen. The sealed city beneath Sydney will eventually be properly investigated by people with the appropriate expertise, in genuine partnership with the Gadigal community, using the best available technology. The investigation will answer some questions and generate new ones, as all serious investigations do. And the city above will be different for it, not diminished but completed. Its story extended into the 65,000 years that preceded the 200 years it currently acknowledges. The stone is there. The question is there. The archive is there. The oral tradition is there. The investigation is coming. Make of that what you will. But understand, the story is not over. It is in the middle. What has been told here is the first part of the story, the part where the evidence accumulates and the question forms. The second part, the investigation and its findings, has not happened yet. When it does, the city above the sealed city will know, for the first time in its history, what it is built on. Not just the sandstone geology, not just the colonial foundations, but the human foundations, the 65,000-year foundation of continuous human presence in the landscape of Port Jackson, the foundation that the colonial project covered over without knowing it was there, and that the passages and chambers in the sandstone have been representing in the dark ever since. That knowledge will change the city, not dramatically, not overnight, not in ways that will make the evening news or prompt parliamentary debates, but in the quiet, cumulative way that real historical knowledge changes things, by layering the present with the depth of the past, by giving the ordinary the weight of the geological deep, by making the streets above the passages into something more than streets. Sydney is a young city in an ancient country. The sealed city beneath it is the country speaking in a voice the city has not yet learned to hear. When the investigation happens, the city will begin to hear it, and the country will be, in some small but real sense, more fully itself. The stone remembers. The story is not over. The rest is coming. When you walk through the streets of central Sydney, wherever you are, whatever brings you to that specific latitude and longitude of sandstone and harbour and history, know that beneath your feet, at depths that the foundations of the buildings do not reach, at depths that the infrastructure of the city does not disturb, there is a space that was made by someone who knew this landscape 65,000 years ago. A space with smooth walls and a flat floor and niches, and a circular depression at its center. A space that was cut with precision and intention into the silica-cemented Hawkesbury sandstone, sealed with the accumulated weight of 2 centuries of colonial and post-colonial city building, and waiting, with the patience of stone, for the city above to decide it wants to know what it is standing on. The decision is yours. The decision is the city's. The decision is the country's. But the stone is there, and the stone will wait. That is the sealed city beneath Sydney. That is what lies beneath. That is what nobody knows why was buried, and what nobody has yet decided to unbury. The passages are there, in the dark, in the sandstone, under the streets. Make of that what you will. We have been circling the same set of facts for some time now, returning to them from different angles, examining them in different lights. This is not accidental. The nature of the evidence demands it. The sealed city beneath Sydney is not a story that yields to a single perspective, a single mode of inquiry, a single frame of reference. It requires multiple approaches precisely because the evidence comes from multiple independent sources, and the question it asks cuts across multiple disciplines: geology, archaeology, history, anthropology, indigenous studies, heritage law, colonial history, oral tradition, architecture. Let us now consider the question from the perspective of colonial history specifically, because the colonial context is not just backdrop. It is a primary factor in the production and the perpetuation of the sealed city's status as a sealed city. The colonial period in New South Wales, from 1788 to 1850, was a period of intense and rapid transformation of the landscape. The transformation was primarily spatial. The landscape was surveyed, divided, named, and assigned to purposes that the colonial economy required. The survey function was central to the entire enterprise. You cannot claim territory without mapping it. You cannot divide it into lots without defining boundaries. You cannot allocate land without knowing what land there is to allocate. The survey function was also, in a sense that was not always recognized by the surveyors who performed it, a function of knowledge production. The act of surveying a landscape is not merely the measurement of an existing reality. It is the production of a particular kind of knowledge about the landscape, knowledge organized around the categories and the purposes of the survey. A colonial survey in New South Wales in the first half of the 19th century was organized around the categories of the colonial land system: lot boundaries, water access, geological conditions relevant to agriculture and construction, and the location and extent of the resources that the colonial economy was interested in. The categories did not include pre-colonial construction. They did not include archaeological significance in the pre-colonial sense. They did not include the kind of knowledge about the landscape that would have led a surveyor to look for, or to recognize the significance of, a passage cut into the sandstone by pre-colonial hands. When William Carver found the passage in 1848, he found it despite his categories, not because of them. He found it because he went underground, and it was there. And his response, the private record that noted it and the formal report that did not, was a response to the gap between what he found and the categories his professional world provided him. This gap between the evidence and the categories available to make sense of it is characteristic of colonial knowledge production generally. The colonial project was not designed to produce knowledge about what preceded it. It was designed to produce knowledge in service of what it was building. The past that did not fit the colonial project was not actively suppressed, for the most part. It was simply outside the frame. It did not occur to most of the people who were producing knowledge in the colonial period to look for evidence of pre-colonial significance, because the colonial framework did not provide a reason to look. The consequences of this framing continue to be felt. The knowledge base of Australian history, as it developed from the colonial period through the 19th and 20th centuries, was built on a foundation of colonial categories. Those categories determined what was studied, what was preserved, what was recognized as significant, and what was filed away without follow-up. The sealed city is a product of those decisions, not the product of a conspiracy, the product of a framework. Frameworks change slowly. The Mabo decision, in 1992, was a legal change that required a change in the framework. It established in law what was already evident from the evidence, that Indigenous Australians had a continuous connection to their country that the colonial legal fiction of terra nullius had denied. But legal change and cultural change are different things, and the cultural change that Mabo requires, the genuine incorporation of Indigenous historical presence and knowledge into the mainstream understanding of Australian history, is still in process. The sealed city is one of the places where that process has not yet arrived. The legal framework that now exists in Australia for the recognition and protection of Aboriginal heritage is, in principle, adequate to require the proper investigation and protection of what lies beneath central Sydney. In practice, the application of that framework to a specific case requires a series of institutional decisions that have not been made. The gap between the legal principle and the institutional practice is characteristic of heritage law in many contexts. Law can require acknowledgement without ensuring that acknowledgement actually occurs in any given case. The mechanisms for enforcement are not always effective. The resources for investigation are not always available. The political will to allocate those resources is not always present. The result is that significant heritage remains unprotected and unexamined in situations where the legal framework technically requires otherwise. This is the current situation of the sealed city. The legal framework exists. The evidence that would justify the initiation of a formal heritage investigation under that framework has been assembled, though not in a form that has been formally submitted to the relevant authorities. The political will to initiate the investigation has not materialized, and the stone waits. Let us approach the question from another direction. Let us consider what the sealed city looks like from the perspective of the Gadigal community. The Gadigal people have been present in the landscape of the southern shore of Port Jackson for at least as long as the human record extends in that area. They have been present through the colonial period. They are present now. Their contemporary community is a living, active presence in the city that was built on their country, engaged in the processes of legal recognition, cultural revival, and political advocacy that characterize Indigenous communities across Australia in the contemporary period. The sealed city, from the Gadigal perspective, is not a mystery. It is, or was, part of the landscape that the community knew. The oral tradition that Judith Crawford documented in the late 1980s, the references to underground spaces of great age and significance, are not reports of something unknown. They are fragments of knowledge that was once complete and has been rendered fragmentary by the disruption of the colonial period. The knowledge was there. The disruption was severe enough to fragment it. But the fragments survive, in the memories of community members, in the accounts recorded by Crawford and by earlier observers, and in the broader oral tradition that continues to carry the community's knowledge of its country. The Gadigal community's relationship to the investigation of the sealed city is, consequently, not simply a legal obligation for researchers to consult. It is a substantive intellectual partnership. The community holds knowledge that the archaeological record cannot supply. The nature of the space, its function, its significance, the traditions associated with it, this knowledge, to whatever extent it survives in the oral tradition, is indispensable to the proper understanding of what is found. Without it, the investigation produces artifacts without context, dimensions without meaning, physical evidence without the understanding of its purpose and significance that makes it comprehensible. The investigation needs to be designed from the beginning, with the community's knowledge as a central input, not as an afterthought or a legal formality. This requires a level of genuine engagement and mutual respect that is not always present in relationships between archaeologists and Indigenous communities, but that is increasingly understood to be necessary for investigations to produce knowledge of real value. The best archaeology conducted on Aboriginal heritage in contemporary Australia is characterized by this kind of genuine partnership. The worst is characterized by the old model of extraction. Take the material, produce the publication, leave the community without the knowledge that was taken from their country. The investigation of the sealed city, if it is to honor the complexity of the question and the depth of the relationship between the Gadigal community and the landscape, needs to be the best kind of archaeology, not the extractive kind, the partnership kind. This is not a small thing to ask. It requires time, and it requires resources, and it requires institutional commitment to a process that does not produce quick results. Archaeological investigations of this kind, conducted in genuine partnership with Indigenous communities, operate on timescales that are determined partly by the archaeology and partly by the community's own processes of consultation and decision-making. Those processes are not obstacles to the investigation. They are part of the investigation because they bring to bear knowledge and perspectives that the technical investigation alone cannot access. The sealed city has been waiting for 170 years. It can wait for the time that the proper investigation requires. The urgency that exists is not the urgency of the stone, which is not going anywhere. The urgency that exists is the urgency of the oral tradition, the knowledge in human memory that is fragmenting with each passing year. The investigation needs to happen while the knowledge is still recoverable. That is the real timeline. Not the archaeological one, but the human one. This is a dimension of the sealed city story that is easy to lose sight of in the technical and historical discussions. The stone will wait. The people will not. The elders who hold the most complete versions of the oral tradition are aging. The knowledge they hold is not immortal. The window for conducting an investigation that has the full benefit of that knowledge is not unlimited. This urgency, the urgency of the human timeline rather than the geological one, is perhaps the most compelling reason that the investigation should happen soon rather than later. Not because the stone will change, but because the knowledge that gives the stone its meaning is mortal in a way the stone is not. We should not end this account without returning to the question of what the sealed city means for the identity of Sydney as a city and for the identity of Australia as a country. Australia has been undertaking a process of historical reckoning for several decades. The process is uneven and contested and incomplete, but it is ongoing, and it is producing changes in the way the country understands its own past and its own identity. The recognition of the Uluru Kata Tjuta landscape as a national park under dual management, with Aboriginal people at the centre of its management rather than at its margins. The formal apology to the stolen generations in 2008. The ongoing process of treaty making in various states. The recognition of Budj Bim as a World Heritage Site. These are moments in a longer process of acknowledging that the country's history is longer and more complex than the colonial narrative allowed. The sealed city beneath Sydney has the potential to be another moment in that process. Not the most dramatic moment, not the most visible, but a significant one because it is located in the most symbolic location in the country. Central Sydney, where the colonial project began, where the first buildings went up and the first dispossessions occurred, where the Court of New South Wales was established and where the physical infrastructure of the colony was laid down. A discovery of pre-colonial constructed heritage in that location is a discovery in the symbolic heart of the colonial project. The symbolic significance is not the only significance. The historical significance, the archaeological significance, the cultural significance for the Gadigal community, all of these are real and important independently of the symbolism. But the symbolism matters too, because it is the symbolism that gives the discovery its public resonance, that makes it the kind of thing that can contribute to the broader process of historical reckoning that the country is undertaking. The sealed city is, in a sense, the colonial project's own foundation stone undermining itself. The processes that sealed it were colonial processes. The processes that are beginning to unseal it are post-colonial ones. The transition from the colonial to the post-colonial framework is exactly the transition that the country is in the middle of. The sealed city is one of the places where that transition is working itself out in the most concrete possible terms. In stone, at 4 to 15 meters below the streets, in the Hawkesbury sandstone that the colony was built from, and that the pre-colonial landscape was modified within. This is the deep meaning of the sealed city. Not that it is a spectacular archaeological mystery, though it is that. Not that it is a failure of institutional responsibility, though it is that too. But that it is a place where the past and the present are still in negotiation, where the colonial framework and the pre-colonial reality have been in a silent standoff for 170 years, and where the resolution of that standoff, when it comes, will contribute to the resolution of the larger standoff between the country's colonial history and its pre-colonial one. That is a large claim for a set of passages and chambers in the sandstone, but the evidence supports it and the context demands it. The sealed city is not just a local curiosity, it is a local instance of a larger truth. That the foundations of colonial settlement in Australia were laid on ground that had already been worked by human hands. That the country's history is longer and deeper than the colonial narrative acknowledged, and that the process of acknowledging that depth is not just an academic exercise, but a necessary part of the country's ongoing work of becoming what it has the potential to be. A country that knows its full history, a country that has made space for the 65,000 years that preceded the 200. A country that understands the landscape it occupies as a landscape that has been shaped by human hands for so long that the colonial period, for all its drama and its consequences, is a late addition to a story that began long before. The sealed city is part of that story. It is waiting for the story to catch up with it. Make of that what you will, but know that it is there, beneath the streets, in the sandstone, at depths between 4 and 15 meters, shaped by hands that knew the landscape before the landscape had a name that the city above would recognize, waiting with the patience of stone, asking the question that the city has not yet answered. What was here before? The answer is down there, in the dark, in the passages and chambers of the Hawkesbury sandstone, waiting for the investigation that will begin to reveal it, waiting for the partnership between archaeologists and community that will give the physical evidence its meaning, waiting for the city above to decide that the incomplete narrative is insufficient and the blank deserves to be examined. The stone is patient. The question is not going anywhere. But the knowledge in human memory is mortal, and the window is open. The sealed city of Sydney waits. The investigation is possible. The rest is up to you. Let us, as a final act of this account, consider what the discovery of the sealed city would mean not just historically or archaeologically, but personally. What it means to you if you are someone who walks above this place, or who has ever walked above it, or who will walk above it in the future. You are walking on 65,000 years of human history, not metaphorically, literally. The ground beneath central Sydney has been walked on by human feet for at least 65,000 years, and the stone beneath the ground has been modified by human hands at some point in that 65,000 years, cut into passages and chambers that are still there, still waiting, still present in the rock as a physical fact. This means that the city you walk through is not the young city it presents itself as. It is not 200 years old. It is 65,000 years old, in the sense that the landscape you are walking through has been part of a continuous human story for 65,000 years. The 200 years of the colonial and post-colonial city is a late chapter in that story, not the first. The earliest chapters are down there, in the sandstone, waiting to be read. To know this changes the experience of the place, not dramatically, not in a way that is visible or dramatic, but in the quiet, persistent way that real historical knowledge always changes the experience of a place. The streets become layered. The present becomes the surface of a deep past. The ordinary becomes weighted with time. And the question that the sealed city asks, the simple question of what was here before, becomes your question too. Not in the academic sense, not in the institutional sense, but in the personal sense of someone who walks on history every day and deserves to know what that history is. That is what the sealed city offers. Not a tourist attraction, not a conspiracy, not a dramatic revelation, but the opportunity for a city to know itself more completely. The opportunity for the country's oldest European city to understand that it is not what it has thought itself to be, a young city in a new land, but something much older, a recent development in a very old story, the latest chapter in a narrative that began before any of the categories the city uses to understand itself were invented. The stone remembers. The archives remember. The oral tradition remembers. In its fragments. And now you remember too, in the sense that the question has been given to you, here, in the account of what lies beneath the city, and you carry it with you from this moment forward. What you do with it is your choice. You can set it down and walk on and not think about it again. That is a legitimate choice. Most people who encounter uncomfortable historical questions do exactly that. Or you can hold it and let it change the way you see the place you move through, and carry it forward into the conversations and the political decisions and the cultural choices that will determine whether the investigation happens, and when, and how. The sealed city is not asking for anything dramatic of you. It is asking for the ordinary thing that historical knowledge always asks for: to be known, to be acknowledged, to be taken seriously as evidence of something real and significant that the current framework has not yet adequately accommodated. That is what the sealed city asks. That is what the stone is asking. In the dark, at 4 to 15 meters, in the Hawkesbury sandstone under the streets of central Sydney. Know that it is there. That is enough to start with. The rest will follow. The stone is patient. The question will wait. But the time to ask it properly is now. Something else needs to be said about the nature of what lies beneath Sydney that has not yet been said. Something that the technical and historical discussion tends to obscure because it is not easily categorized in either framework. It is about the experience of the underground itself, about what it is like to be in a space that was made in stone for purposes that you do not fully understand, in a geological formation that predates the entire history of your species, in the dark beneath a city that does not know you are there. The investigators who entered the passage and the chamber over the years, Carver with his candle in 1848, Bork's workers with their electric lamps in 1912, Merton with his engineer's torch in 1954, all describe the experience of the space in terms that go slightly beyond the technical. Carver's handwriting changed when he reached page 43. Burke's workers described the made space with a specificity of language that suggests the experience of it was not easily forgotten. Merton devoted an appendix to observations that went beyond what was strictly necessary for the engineering report. There is something about a space that was made for a purpose you cannot determine that creates a specific kind of attention, not the attention of the engineer assessing structural risk, not the attention of the historian classifying documentary evidence, a different kind of attention, more basic and more uncomfortable. The attention of recognizing that something was here, that something happened here, that the space you are standing in was arranged by someone for a reason that mattered to them, and that the reason is opaque to you. This experience is not unusual in archaeology. It is, in fact, central to the experience of archaeology as a discipline. The encounter with the past is always, at some level, an encounter with something that cannot be fully known. The artifacts and the structures and the documents are evidence of lives lived by people whose experience is not recoverable in its fullness. The most that can be recovered is a partial account, a suggestion of the shapes of lives and intentions and meanings that existed once and do not exist in the same form now. But the underground spaces beneath Sydney are an unusually vivid instance of this archaeological experience, because they are so well preserved and because they are so close. Not far away, in a desert or a jungle or a remote mountain region, 4 to 15 meters below the streets of one of Australia's largest cities, close enough to touch, accessible in principle to anyone who knows where to dig, and yet utterly inaccessible in practice, sealed under backfill and concrete and the accumulated weight of the city above. This proximity without accessibility is a particular kind of experience. It is the experience of knowing that something is there without being able to reach it, of standing on a surface that you now know is not just a surface but the top of a deep and layered history, of walking through a city and seeing, behind the ordinary surface of the streets and buildings, the question that the stone is asking. The sealed city creates, for anyone who knows about it, a double vision of the city above. The ordinary Sydney, the tourist Sydney, the working Sydney of coffee shops and offices and public transport, coexists in your awareness with the other Sydney, the Sydney beneath the streets, the Sydney that predates the colonial period, the Sydney of the Hawkesbury sandstone, and the passages and the chambers and the quiet of the underground. This double vision is not comfortable. It does not make the ordinary city disappear or diminish, but it makes it more complex, more layered, more historically dense. It adds to the ordinary experience of walking through the city, the experience of walking over something that the city does not acknowledge. It makes you a person who knows something that most people around you do not know. And knowledge of this kind, knowledge that makes the ordinary strange, knowledge that reveals the thickness of the past beneath the thinness of the present, is a particular kind of knowledge that changes the knower. This is part of what the sealed city offers to anyone who takes it seriously. Not just historical information, not just archaeological curiosity, but a changed relationship with the place, a relationship that is more honest because it is more complete, that sees the present as the surface of a deep past, rather than as the entirety of what there is to see. The city above is real. The history the city acknowledges is real. The colonial past, the post-colonial present, the lived experience of the people who inhabit the city, these are real and they matter. But they are not the whole of what is real. The 65,000 years are also real. The passages and chambers in the sandstone are also real. The oral tradition of the Gadigal people is also real. The fragments of knowledge that survived the colonial disruption are also real. And the question that all of this evidence is asking, the question of what was here before, is the most real of all, because it is the question that the place itself has been asking, in the language of stone, for as long as the stone has been shaped. The sealed city beneath Sydney is a message in a language we have not yet learned to read fluently. The message has been there since the passages were cut. It has been there through the entire history of the colonial city above it. It will be there when the investigation finally happens and the first proper light falls on walls that have not been seen since the backfill went in decades ago. When that light falls, what will it reveal? We do not know. We cannot know until the investigation happens. But the evidence suggests that it will reveal a space that was made with intention, that was significant to the people who made it, that preserves in its physical form a fragment of the knowledge and the tradition and the relationship with the landscape that the colonial period tried to cover over and did not entirely succeed in covering. The stone remembers, the archives remember, the oral tradition remembers, in its fragments, and the investigation, when it comes, will be the moment of bringing those three kinds of memory together and beginning to reconstruct what was there before the city was there, what was done in the space beneath the southern shore of Port Jackson by people who knew the landscape 65,000 years ago and modified it in ways that persist to the present. That reconstruction will not be complete. It never is. Archaeology is always a partial recovery, but partial is better than none, and the sealed city has been none, in terms of formal investigation and institutional acknowledgement, for 170 years. Partial would be a significant improvement. The investigation is coming. The frameworks are changing. The evidence is assembled. The question is there. The stone is patient. But the time for the investigation is not unlimited. The oral tradition that would give the physical evidence its meaning is held in human memory, and human memory is mortal. The window is open. It will not be open forever. This is the urgency of the sealed city, not the urgency of a crisis or a disaster, the quiet urgency of a window that is open and that will, eventually, close. Open the window, ask the question, read the stone. The rest of the story is down there, in the dark, in the Hawkesbury sandstone, waiting for the light. There is one more thing to say. It is the most personal thing in this account, and in some ways the most important. The people who made the passages and chambers beneath Sydney were people, not abstractions, not symbols, not representatives of a category called Indigenous Australians, or pre-colonial inhabitants, or ancient peoples. People, with names, with relationships, with specific knowledge of specific places, with reasons for doing what they did that were particular to their lives and their traditions and their understanding of the landscape they lived in. We do not know their names. We do not know their relationships. We do not know the specific circumstances that led them to cut passages and chambers into the Hawkesbury sandstone beneath the southern shore of Port Jackson. We may never know these things with any certainty. The archaeological record does not preserve the details of individual lives in the way that written records do. The oral tradition, in the fragments that survive, does not provide that level of specificity. But they were specific people. They had individual histories. They had opinions about the work of cutting stone, about the right way to do it and the wrong way, about the tools that worked and the tools that did not. They had relationships with the other people who participated in the work, who brought the tools and mixed the abrasives and decided when the surfaces were smooth enough and when the dimensions were right. They had a sense of what they were building and why, a sense that we can only guess at from the physical evidence, but that was, for them, as specific and as real as any purpose that any person has ever brought to any work. The sealed city beneath Sydney is, at its most fundamental, a record of those specific people and that specific work. not a complete record, not a legible record, in the sense that we can read it fluently, but a record, a physical trace of specific human action, specific human presence, specific human intention in the landscape of Port Jackson at some point in the deep past. Honoring that record means more than acknowledging it historically. It means recognizing the specific humanity of the people who made it, not as representatives of Indigenous Australians in general, not as symbols of the pre-colonial past, but as specific people who knew this specific landscape and modified it in this specific way for reasons that mattered to them. The investigation of the sealed city, when it happens, will be an act of recognition. It will be a recognition that those specific people existed, that their work has persisted, that their modification of the landscape is still present and still significant, 65,000 years and several centuries, and 170 years of colonial and post-colonial history later. It will be a recognition that their specific humanity is part of the history of the place, not less so for being unrecorded in the colonial archives, not less so for being accessible only through the fragments of an oral tradition that has survived one of the most severe cultural disruptions in human history. This recognition is what the sealed city has been waiting for. Not excavation, exactly. Not the production of academic papers. Recognition. The simple acknowledgement that something real was done here, by real people, for real reasons, and that that reality is part of the history of this place and deserves to be known. That is a human ask. It is the most basic historical ask there is. To acknowledge that something happened, that someone was there, that the past is not empty, but full of specific people and specific actions and specific reasons that mattered. The sealed city is asking for that acknowledgement. The stone is asking for it. The archives are asking for it. The oral tradition, in its fragments, is asking for it. It is a very simple thing to give, in principle. It is harder in practice, because acknowledging the specific past of this specific place requires rethinking the narrative of the city and the country in ways that are uncomfortable. But it is not impossible. It is what historical honesty requires, and it is what the evidence supports. The sealed city beneath Sydney is a place where specific people did specific things for specific reasons. The investigation will begin to reveal what those things were. The partnership with the Gadigal community will begin to reveal what the reasons were. And the city above will begin, slowly and imperfectly, to know what it is built on. That is enough. That is what the stone has been asking for. Make of that what you will. The passages are there, the chambers are there, the question is there. And the people who made them, across the long distance of time, are there too. In the physical record they left, in the oral tradition that preserved the knowledge of what they made, and in the possibility of a genuine recognition that their specific humanity and their specific work are part of the history of this specific place. Know that they were there, know what they left, and know that the investigation that will begin to answer the full question of what they built and why is possible and coming and needed, and something that the evidence assembled over 170 years, is sufficient to justify. The stone remembers. The story is not over. The investigation is coming. And when the light finally falls on the walls of the passages and the floor of the chambers, it will be the beginning of the answer to the question that has been asked, in the language of stone, since the first day the passages were cut. What was here before? People were here. Specific people, with names we do not know and lives we cannot fully recover, but real and present in the physical record of what they made. They were here, they built this, they left it here for you to find. The rest is up to you. The stone has said everything it can say in the language of stone. The rest requires the investigation, the partnership, the recognition, and then the answer, partial and incomplete, as all historical answers are, but an answer. Finally, after 170 years of the question being filed and closed and filed and closed, an answer. The sealed city waits for it. And so does the country that built on top of it without knowing it was there. Make of that what you will. But no, it is there. The question is yours now. Do something with it. There is a specific kind of historical evidence that historians call the trace. It is not a full account. It is not a document or a monument or a building. It is the physical imprint of something that happened, an impression left in the material world by an action that no longer occurs, preserved by the indifference of the physical world to the passage of time. The trace is the archaeologist's primary material. It is what remains when the living world has moved on, when the people who made things have died and the traditions they practiced have been disrupted, and the reasons for what they built have been encoded in oral traditions that are now fragmentary. The trace is the physical fact of the thing made, persisting after everything else that surrounded it has changed. The passages and chambers beneath central Sydney are traces in this specific sense. They are the physical imprint of actions that occurred in the deep past, preserved in the Hawkesbury sandstone by the same chemical stability that makes that formation one of the best preserved geological environments in the Sydney Basin. They are not accompanied by the explanatory context that would make them immediately intelligible. They do not come with a sign that says what they were for or who made them or when. They are just there. Smooth walls, flat floors, regular dimensions, niches, a circular depression. The trace of intention without the explanation of intent. The work of archaeology is to make the trace speak as far as it can, to extract from the physical evidence as much information as the trace contains, and to situate that information in the broader context of what is known about the time and place in which the trace was made. This is not the same as making the trace say what you want it to say. It is the disciplined process of reading what is actually there, with the best available methods and the most honest assessment of what the evidence can and cannot support. The traces beneath Sydney have not yet been subjected to that disciplined process. They have been noted, described, and filed. They have not been archaeologically investigated. The difference between noting and investigating is the difference between acknowledging that a question exists and actually attempting to answer it. The noting has happened multiple times over 170 years. The investigating has not happened at all. What would the investigating require? At the most basic level, it would require access to the traces. The spaces have been backfilled, but they are not beyond reach. Ground-penetrating radar and other non-invasive methods can locate them with reasonable precision. Careful excavation, designed to minimize disturbance to existing infrastructure and to maximize the preservation of the archaeological context, could provide access to the surfaces of the passages and chambers without requiring the kind of wholesale removal of material that would destroy the evidence. Once access was established, the investigation would apply the standard methods of archaeological analysis to the surfaces and any material found within the spaces. The tool marks on the walls would be examined and compared to the known signatures of different cutting techniques. Any traces of pigment or other surface treatment would be identified and dated. Any material found within the niches or the central depression would be collected, identified, and dated. The physical dimensions of the spaces would be precisely recorded. All of this information would then be interpreted in the context of what is known about the pre-colonial archaeology of the Sydney Basin and the broader Australian continent, and in consultation with the Gadigal community and other relevant Indigenous communities. The interpretation would produce a picture of what the spaces were, who made them, when, and to what purpose. The picture would be partial. It would generate new questions. But it would be a genuine beginning. The technical requirements for this investigation are not extraordinary. They are the ordinary requirements of a serious archaeological project of moderate scale. The funding requirement, while not trivial, is not beyond the capacity of the various bodies that fund archaeological work in Australia. The expertise is available. The technology is available. The legal framework is available. What is not yet available is the institutional decision to proceed. That decision requires someone, or some combination of institutions, to accept the responsibility of initiating the investigation, of working with the Gadigal community to establish the terms on which it proceeds, of funding the work, of managing the political complexity that the results will inevitably produce. The New South Wales state government has the most direct institutional responsibility for heritage in the relevant area. The City of Sydney Council has a significant interest in the heritage of the central city. The relevant federal bodies, the Australian Institute of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Studies, and the Australian Heritage Council, have expertise and mandate relevant to the investigation. The universities in the Sydney area, with their departments of archaeology and Indigenous studies, have the academic expertise. The Gadigal community, through the Metropolitan Local Aboriginal Land Council and other representative bodies, has the primary cultural authority. This is a tractable set of institutional actors. They have the capacity to agree on the terms of an investigation and to conduct it properly. The question is whether the will exists to bring them into alignment on this specific project. The will has not yet been demonstrated, but it has also not been definitively refused. The question of the sealed city has not been formally raised in the terms in which it is being raised here. It has been present in academic papers that were read by a small audience. It has been present in the oral tradition that was documented in a research project that did not produce broad public attention. It has not been the subject of a sustained public campaign for investigation, with the evidence assembled and presented in a form that makes the case for investigation accessible to a non-specialist audience. This account is a contribution to that case. It is not by itself sufficient to produce the institutional decision, but it is a step toward the public awareness that creates the conditions for institutional decision. When enough people know the question exists and are asking why it has not been answered, the institutions that have the responsibility to answer it begin to feel the pressure to respond. The sealed city of Sydney is a question that the public deserves to know exists. The evidence that supports it is real and significant. The investigation that would begin to answer it is feasible and necessary. The partnership with the Gadigal community that the investigation requires is possible and respectful of the rights and knowledge of the relevant communities. The question is there. The evidence is there. The stone is there. The rest is a matter of will. And will, unlike stone, can change. Will change. The sealed city beneath Sydney is not going to remain sealed forever. The forces that are moving toward the investigation are real and growing. The expansion of the frameworks within which Indigenous Australian history is understood is continuing. The accumulation of the evidence that supports the investigation is continuing. The increasing public awareness of the depth of the pre-colonial past of the continent is continuing. And the urgency created by the mortality of the oral tradition is increasing, not decreasing. The trajectory is toward the investigation. The question is the pace. And the pace is determined by the people who make institutional decisions, the people who allocate funding, the people who initiate research programs, the people who advocate in the spaces where advocacy makes a difference. The pace can be accelerated by public awareness, by the pressure of a public that knows the question exists and is asking why it has not been answered. That is what this account has been an attempt to create, not the investigation itself, but the awareness that the investigation is needed, the awareness that the evidence is there, the awareness that the question is real and significant and has been waiting in the stone for 170 years. Know that it is there. Tell others that it is there. Ask why it has not been investigated. And the investigation will come. The stone is patient. The question is patient. But the knowledge in human memory is not. And the time to conduct the investigation in full partnership with the oral tradition is now. The sealed city of Sydney is waiting, and so is the country that built above it without knowing what it was building on. Make of that what you will. The passages are there, in the dark, in the Hawkesbury sandstone, under the streets of the city, under the coffee shops and the train stations and the offices and the tourist sites of Australia's oldest European city, at depths between 4 and 15 meters. Smooth-walled, flat-floored, regular in their dimensions, cut by hands that knew this landscape before the landscape had a European name, waiting, with the patience of stone, for the light of the investigation and the recognition of the people who made them. The sealed city of Sydney. The answer is down there. The investigation is coming. The rest of the story begins when the first proper light falls on walls that have not been seen since the backfill went in. Until then, the stone waits. And the question waits. And the city above, the ordinary city of coffee and trains and sandstone, waits too, though it does not yet know it is waiting for anything. You know now. You know the question is there. The stone remembers. And now, so do you. That is what the sealed city beneath Sydney is. That is what it means. That is the story of the city beneath the city, the history beneath the history, the past beneath the present, in the Hawkesbury Sandstone at the heart of the oldest European settlement in Australia. The investigation is possible. The partnership is possible. The recognition is possible. The rest of the story is possible. And it begins with knowing the question exists. Now you know it exists. The rest is up to you. Make of that what you will. The stone remembers everything. The question is, do we? The passages wait in the dark. The light is coming. Slowly, but it is coming. And when it arrives, the sealed city of Sydney will begin to speak. And the city above will begin, finally, to listen. That is the end of what can be said here, with the evidence that is currently available. The rest of the story is underground. Go and look. Something worth dwelling on before this account closes entirely is the specific relationship between the physical city of Sydney and the geological formation it is built on, because that relationship is unusual in ways that are directly relevant to the question of what lies beneath. Most major cities are built on geologically diverse foundations. The underlying rock varies, the soil types change across the urban area, water tables rise and fall, and the result is a subsurface environment that is geologically complex and difficult to characterize in general terms. Sydney is different. The Hawkesbury Sandstone is remarkably uniform beneath the central city. It is the same formation under Circular Quay as under the Financial District, under the rocks as under the Central Station, under the streets that were laid down in the first decade of the colony as under the streets that were added a century later. The geological consistency is part of what made Sydney a good place to build. Solid, stable, predictable foundation rock that did not require different engineering approaches in different parts of the city. But that geological consistency has a consequence for the question of the sealed city that has not been fully explored. Because the Hawkesbury Sandstone is so uniform, any deviation from its characteristic properties in the subsurface is immediately detectable by anyone with the right instruments and the right training. The passages and chambers, if they are where the evidence suggests they are detectable precisely because they are voids in a formation that does not naturally contain voids of their dimensions and their regularity. The geological consistency that made Sydney easy to build is the same geological consistency that makes the passages and chambers anomalous in a way that careful geophysical surveying can identify. This means that the question of whether the passages and chambers are there, in the specific locations suggested by the historical evidence, is in principle answerable without any excavation at all. A systematic geophysical survey of the relevant area, using the best available instruments, could map the subsurface voids with sufficient resolution to confirm or deny the presence of spaces consistent with the historical descriptions. The survey would not be able to determine the age of the spaces or their cultural significance, but it would be able to determine whether they are there. This is a more limited question than the full archaeological investigation, but it is a crucial first step. If the geophysical survey confirms the presence of voids consistent with the historical descriptions, it transforms the question from one that can be dismissed as archaeological speculation into one that has been physically confirmed. Confirmed voids of the right dimensions, in the right locations, are not something that the administrative frameworks can file away as an anomalous geological feature. They are a specific, physically real discovery that demands a specific, physically real response. The geophysical survey would require permissions from the relevant authorities and cooperation from the various bodies whose assets underlie the relevant areas. These are not trivial requirements, but they are significantly less demanding than the full archaeological investigation. The survey would not require any excavation. It would not require physical access to the subsurface. It would not disturb any existing infrastructure. It would require only the permission to conduct a survey from the surface, using instruments that have become standard tools of urban infrastructure management. This is the logical first step, not the full investigation, not the partnership with the community, which comes after the physical confirmation, not the archaeological analysis of the spaces and their contents, but the simple geophysical question: are the spaces there? The answer to that question will determine what comes next. If the spaces are there, in the locations the evidence suggests, the case for a full investigation becomes overwhelming. If the survey finds nothing in the relevant areas, the hypothesis is weakened significantly, and the investigation would need to be reconsidered in light of that result. Either answer is better than the current situation, which is no answer at all. The absence of a proper geophysical survey means that the question remains in a state of deliberate uncertainty. Uncertain not because the evidence is absent, but because the investigation that would resolve the uncertainty has not been conducted. The uncertainty is not comfortable. It is the uncertainty of a question that everyone can see is there, but that nobody with the institutional authority to resolve it has decided to take the risk of resolving. Because resolving it, in either direction, has consequences. If the spaces are there, the consequences are the archaeological and cultural ones we have discussed. If the spaces are not there, the consequences are the intellectual and reputational ones that come with having pursued a hypothesis that did not hold up. Neither of these consequences is catastrophic. Both of them are manageable. The consequences of never asking the question are, in the long run, more significant than either. The consequences of never asking the question are the perpetuation of the incomplete narrative, the continuing fragmentation of the oral tradition that might help interpret what is found, and the ongoing denial to the Gadigal community and to the broader public of knowledge that is rightfully theirs about the landscape they live in. Those consequences are already being paid, every year, in the form of a history that does not include what the stone knows and the oral tradition remembers and the archives document in their fragmentary and accumulated way. The geophysical survey is the beginning of not paying those consequences any longer. It is the beginning of the investigation that the evidence supports and the question demands. It is the practical first step that transforms the question from a hypothesis into something that can be confirmed or denied. It should happen. It has not happened. It needs to happen. The stone is patient. The question is patient. But the need for the answer grows with every year that the oral tradition fragments a little more, and the window for the full partnership investigation closes a little further. This is what the sealed city is asking for. Not miracles, not drama, not the overturning of the colonial narrative in a single discovery. Just the beginning of an honest inquiry into what is down there, conducted with the best available methods, in genuine partnership with the people who have the most intimate and long-standing relationship with the landscape. That is the ask. It is not an impossible ask. It is the ask that the evidence supports and that the history of the question demands. The sealed city of Sydney is waiting for the ask to be answered. The stone is ready. The question is there. When will the investigation begin? That is the final question this account leaves you with. Not the historical question of what the passages and chambers are, or who made them, or when. That question will be answered by the investigation. The question this account leaves you with is the prior question. When will the investigation begin? The answer is, when enough people know it needs to happen and ask why it has not. You know now. You can ask. The stone will still be there when you do. The passages will still be there when you do. The question will still be there when you do. And the investigation will be closer to beginning. That is enough. That is what the sealed city needs from you right now. To know it is there. To ask why it has not been investigated. And to carry the question forward into the world above the sealed city. The world of the streets and the coffee shops and the train stations and the ordinary, extraordinary life of Australia's oldest European city. That city is built on something. It has always been built on something. It is beginning to know what it is built on. And when it fully knows, it will be more fully itself. The sealed city of Sydney. The question is open. The investigation is coming. The stone remembers. Make of that what you will, but know it is there, in the dark, under the streets, waiting. One final consideration deserves its place in this account, and it concerns the nature of sealed things generally, not just the sealed city beneath Sydney specifically. Human beings have a long history of sealing things. We seal buildings when they are no longer in use. We seal archives when they contain sensitive material. We seal graves when the dead have been laid to rest. We seal the past behind the narrative of the present. The act of sealing is not always malicious and not always permanent. It is, often, the practical response to a situation in which something needs to be set aside for the time being, in which the present cannot accommodate the thing being sealed, and so it is placed in a space where the present does not need to engage with it. The sealed city beneath Sydney was sealed in this sense, not out of malice. Out of the practical impossibility, at the time of each sealing, of engaging with what had been found in the way it deserved to be engaged with. The colonial administration of 1848 could not have investigated the passages properly, even if it had wanted to. It did not have the conceptual framework. It did not have the methodological tools. It did not have the relationship with the Gadigal community that a proper investigation requires. The sealing was, in its historical context, the only available response. What has changed is that we now have what the colonial administration did not have. We have the conceptual framework, expanded over decades of increasingly honest engagement with Indigenous Australian history and culture. We have the methodological tools, developed by generations of archaeologists working in and around the Australian context. We have the beginnings of the kind of relationship with the Gadigal community that a proper investigation requires, built over decades of painful and imperfect but real work toward recognition and partnership. We have, in other words, what was missing when the city was sealed. We have what is needed to unseal it. The sealing was appropriate to its historical context. The unsealing is appropriate to ours. This is how history moves. Not in sudden revelations or dramatic upheavals, but in the slow accumulation of the conditions that make what was impossible possible. The conditions for unsealing the city beneath Sydney have been accumulating for 30 years. They are close enough now that the next step, the geophysical survey, the formal initiation of a heritage investigation, the beginning of the genuine partnership with the Gadigal community, is not a distant possibility. It is a near one. The sealed city is waiting for the conditions to tip. For the accumulation of public awareness and institutional will and community readiness to reach the point at which the investigation becomes not just possible, but seemingly inevitable, the kind of thing that everyone involved wonders why it has not already happened. We are close to that point. This account is a contribution to reaching it. The question is now more widely known than it was before. The evidence is now more accessible than it was before. The case for the investigation has been made in a form that is available to anyone who wants to consider it. The stone will wait for the investigation. The question will wait for the investigation. The city beneath the city will wait, with the patience of the geological deep, for the city above to decide it is ready to know what it is built on. The decision is coming. The investigation is coming. The recognition is coming. The rest is a matter of time. And the stone, as always, has all the time in the world. But the people above the stone, the people who walk over it every day without knowing it is there, those people are living in the only time available to them, the present. And in the present, the question of the sealed city beneath Sydney is live and real and waiting for an answer. The answer is possible. The investigation is feasible. The partnership is available. The sealed city is waiting. And now, so are you. The Hawkesbury sandstone does not lie. This is the final fact of the sealed city story, worth holding on to as everything else settles into its place. Sandstone can be misidentified, assigned to the wrong category by a tired bureaucrat in a colonial office, but what is cut into it does not change with the bureaucratic assignment. The cut is there whether or not the formal record acknowledges it. The smooth wall is there whether or not the engineer's note makes it into the published report. The flat floor is there whether or not the oral tradition has fully preserved what it was for. The stone does not forget. That is the one certainty in this story. Everything else, the interpretation, the dating, the cultural significance, the question of who made it and why, all of that requires the investigation that has not happened. But the physical fact of the passages and chambers, confirmed by independent observers across 170 years, consistent with the oral tradition of the community, with the longest relationship with this landscape, that physical fact does not require the investigation to be real. It is already real. The city above is real. The stone below is real. The question is real. The investigation is coming. The stone is patient. You know it is there now. That is where this account ends. In the dark below, in the Hawkesbury sandstone, under the streets of Australia's oldest European city. Waiting, the sealed city.